Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second day of the North Carolina Coastal Resources Commission meeting. I see we have all the same attendees from yesterday, so I think the roll is okay at this time. First up on our agenda is, I have no comments except for one. I know that the Assistant Secretary is still here today, so we welcome her back. Appreciate her attending both days of meetings. I know she's doing some business downstairs, I think. First up is public comment. Daniel, we have a sign-in sheet. Thank you very much. I'd like to commend staff on all trying to be Angela this week. I see how many people it takes for, to do Angela's job. I don't believe you're paying her enough, Tancred. So, first up is, Clark Wright, and I'm not sure if Clark is here this morning. He said he might not be here. Okay, not seeing Clark. Michael Powell, Ocean Isle. Good morning.
Right here?
Yes, and state your name and where you're from.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Michael Powell. I am a resident of Ocean Isle Beach. I have lived in that area for the past 60+ years. I own a real estate appraisal firm at Ocean Isle, Mike Powell Appraisal Group. And over the past 42 years, I have personally appraised several thousand properties on Ocean Isle Beach. I want to commend all of those that have worked so hard to develop the data, reports, and recommendations, which are the subject of this meeting. Having said that, I do have a concern regarding the proposed setbacks in the area just westward of the Ocean Isle Beach Terminal growing and the reported erosion rates in this particular area since the growing was completed. Since the terminal growing was designed to be, quote, leaky, which means some sand is allowed to pass from the west side to the east side of the growing, it appears that erosion closest to the west side of the growing should most likely be higher than areas measured farther westward. This may help to explain why the yearly erosion rate has been so high in this particular area. The current method of measuring erosion does not take into account future beach renourishment. This particular area just west of the growing is going to be caught up in a cycle of sand added, some sand eroding through the growing, and measured erosion rates constantly higher than other areas of Ocean Isle. This result will result in setback lines that are much more severe than the majority of setbacks on Ocean Isle. I would hope that the committee takes a closer look at this particular area and takes into account that a different metric may be needed when determining the proposed setback, since this particular area clearly has much more beach strand than what existed prior to the completion of the terminal growing back in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, would you please note that Commissioner High is in attendance and Commissioner Smith is not yet here yet. My mistake from earlier. Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else wish to speak at public comment? We welcome anyone else to come up to the podium and give us your thoughts. Seeing none, public comment is now closed. Ken, I believe it's you, action items and rulemaking. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Commission. Good morning, and for the record, my name is Ken Richardson. This morning I will, just like you've seen in the past, do a little quick intro for beach management plan considerations, and then Mr. Chris Gibson will come up and present the town's beach management plan.
Is this
Yeah.
the beach management plan?
Yes, this is the beach management plan for Topsail Island.
Excuse for that one.
Motion to recuse Commissioner Hennessy from this agenda item. Motion by Commissioner Emery, seconded by Commissioner Holman. All in favor? All opposed? It is so carried. Sorry for the interruption, Ken.
And just, so what I want to do is just take a moment to remind the commission why the town is bringing their beach management plan to the commission for you to consider. And then the town will, present their plan and just give you a summary of that, and then I'll also provide staff recommendations. Just a reminder, setbacks are measured from the vegetation line or the pre-project vegetation line. The pre-project vegetation or measurement line, but it's focusing on the pre-project line for the purposes of this discussion. Before a community installs a large-scale beach nourishment project, the vegetation line is mapped, and so this line will be used for measuring setbacks forever and ever and ever, unless the actual vegetation line moves farther landward of that. And this is flagged in coordination with either the engineer or consultant or the town, in coordination with the Division of Coastal Management. Again, the definition of a large-scale beach nourishment project is one that places more than 300,000 cubic yards of sediment material on the beach. And again, it is established before the construction starts, and then it never expires. So one of the things that, well, typically some communities may also, in addition to doing beach nourishment, choose to install or plant vegetation. So the CRC has always recognized that planted vegetation line is not the same as stable and natural, and that line should not be used for measuring setbacks. And so it wasn't until about 2009 that the commission codified that in rule, or 1995 that the commission codified that in rule, and that was the static vegetation line at that time. And then this became the pre-project vegetation line. Couple of scenarios that could typically follow, either not enough time has passed or storm intensity and frequency has not been there, or either the erosion outpaces the maintenance of that project. But typically what we would see in scenario number one is the project gets installed. If it's not maintained or erosion outpaces the maintenance, the erosion will eventually bring the shoreline and the vegetation line back to pre-project conditions. And so the CRC recognizes that, that artificially created beach should not be an incentive for new development, and that existing development needs to kind of be held to that pre-project state. Scenario two, the beach is maintained, and the communities in North Carolina that have shown that with installing that initial project and maintaining it on a regular basis, you can see that seaward growth of vegetation line, or that seaward growth of vegetation. And in time, communities came to the commission to seek some regulatory relief. So you had these vacant lots that could not meet setbacks from the pre-project vegetation line, but given that the vegetation had become stable and natural and moved seaward, they could meet those setbacks. So that later evolved into your beach management plan rules. And this is what this is the example showing where you can meet setback from that vegetation line, but could not meet setback from the pre-project vegetation line. A CRC approved plan is that setbacks are measured from the vegetation line, but you're held to your landward most adjacent neighbor. Structures that are greater than 5,000 square feet only have to meet a setback of 60 times the erosion rate for 120 feet. So if you're familiar with your graduated setbacks, you can see that the setbacks can be much greater depending on the size of the structure. So that there's some regulatory relief there. And also your grandfathering rules, before the beach management plan rules apply to structures that were built before August 11th of 2009. And that's when your graduated setback rules went into effect. But with the beach management plan rules, one of the additional pieces that was added to that is if your town has a CRC approved beach management plan, then, then the grandfathering applies to all the structures there as well. So a few things that the commission has tasked itself with doing is, just like a financial plan, if you don't implement, it's one thing to have the plan, but if you don't implement the plan, then you're not going to see the results. And so one of the things that the commission has asked the towns to do is provide some information for you to consider before you approve their plan, and that is a summary of the Beachville projects that they've done in the past, because you want to see that the plan is being effective, not just that, they have a plan. You want to see what's been done, is it effective in mitigating the erosion? And then also you want to look at sediment resources and financial resources to cover maintenance of the project from no less than a period of 30 years. So it's essentially a 30-year beach management plan. Then also the other piece that was added is that the towns also have to include public comments. So they would include that in either a public hearing or part of one of their local government meetings. And so staff have reviewed the town's plan and have confirmed that all the pieces that are required are contained within the plan. So the staff will be considering or recommending that the commission consider approving the plan. But I do want to invite Chris Gibson up to present the town's plan and just give you a summary of.
Morning, Chris.
Good morning. Thank you all for having me here today to represent Topsail Beach. I'd like to start off with a little anecdotal story, because the Topsail Beach's program is not just a beach plan, but it's a beach inlet and sound management plan. It's a holistic plan for managing the whole town. When I was 16 years old, I was sitting at the dinner table with at the time, Barry Holliday, who was the chief of navigation for the Corps of Engineers, Wilmington District at the time. And we had just come in from a day group of fishing and had been a little sketchy coming through Topsail Inlet. And the sidecaster had been working off to the north, and we had to come through a slot that was on the south. And I asked Barry, I was like, why do they dredge the way they do? And he said, well, it's actually the studies are more expensive than the dredging, and it'll take a literal act of Congress to change it. That was 40 years ago this week. It was right after my birthday. Today, we're standing here with a better plan that didn't take an act of Congress. So just saying that. We started work, the town of Topsail Beach began a venture to get a 50-year CSDR in 2002. In 2007, they realized that that was still a ways off. They put together a plan using the inlet ebb shoal to nourish the beach. That turned out to not be cost effective. So we got pulled in 2009 and looked at, initial project was to use disposal sites that had become derelict because they were full, to use that material on the beach, as well as some of the navigation channels within the Topsail Inlet system. We did that project in 2010, 2011. And in 2011, because of the requirements of FEMA to have a long-term management plan to become an engineered beach, the town adopted their 30-year management plan in 2011. That plan not only had how to manage what they had done as an interim project, but also plans to build their own CSDR project over time. Today, we've gotten through the fruition of building a full-fledged CSDR project that is also an inlet management project, and we're here to present that to the town today. So the plan, as I mentioned, is the BIS program, Beach Inlet and Sound. What the project involves is nourishing approximately 24,000 feet of beach. It did recreate a new set of dunes in front of the previously existing dunes. And we manage 6 sections of channel in the back bay that are beach quality material, primarily Topsail Inlet itself. The green is what we call the connector channel, where it connects between the inlet and banks channel. Yellow is the cut through over to Topsail Creek. Red is Topsail Creek. Blue is the banks channel. And then there's some side channels that are there for homes, as well as the commercial district of Topsail. All of the material in here has been perfectly beach quality sand. It came from the beach. There is no sand input or material input from a riverine environment here. So the sand has, in each of our projects to date over the last 14 years, has been nearly identical within a hundredth of a millimeter to what is on the beach naturally. It comes from the beach, it goes back 30 years of studies, looking at dredging records for the Corps of Engineers, managing Topsail Inlet, and the amount of sand that was dredged out of Topsail Inlet each year was nearly identical to the erosion rate of Topsail Beach. So basically, we set up a recycling system. We lose about 250,000 yards a year off of the beach. We gain about 250,000 yards a year in the end. So let it roll down, take it back, roll it till it's round over the next 30 years. We have 3 thresholds for triggers to activate projects, which we have used over the past 14 years. One is temporal, working with the FEMA regulations, which requires you to do it every 5 years. We've chosen every 4 to be a little more proactive and stay ahead of the game. Also looking from a navigation perspective, that's probably more in line with what we need to do. Oceanfront volumetric losses. So if you look up at the top figure there, you can see the purple line is where we kind of started. The blue line is what we initially, our final construction in 2021. And the red line is what we have. If we get back to that red line to where there's the potential for the ocean to come up on the dunes during a storm event, we're going to go back and replenish that. There's plenty of material recycling in the inlet to do this. And then the other is inlet and interior channel shoal. The Corps of Engineers channels are relatively small, especially going to the slot in the inlet. It's only 150 feet wide and 8 feet deep. That's not a lot of freeboard for any kind of boat, especially folks from Dare County know if you're running a 50-footer, you certainly don't want to be going through 8 foot of water in the sea. So what we've done in order to meet the capabilities of the dredging industry for offshore certified dredges and to give us a what we call in the industry advanced maintenance, we've widened the channel going through the inlet to about 450 feet. And then we've dropped it down to 16+2, which is the preferred dredging depth for industry to make all of the companies competitive. This allows us the 4 years instead of 3 months that we were getting from the sidecaster between dredging events. Just going over the projects that we did initially in 2010, 2011, we did a million yards of material. 500,000 of that came out of DA 241, what's that? 243, I'm sorry. And then the purple one is a DA 189, which is right up by my house. We took 300 some thousand yards out of that, and then a combined 200+ thousand yards out of these smaller channels, digging only to the Corps' authorized depth at the time because we didn't have permits to go deeper. Hurricane Irene hit immediately after construction in 2011. So we had to go back and got some money from FEMA to go back. In the first phase of that, the concept was to go back 2 years in a row, go back to the navigation channels, dredge those navigation channels. We wanted to put it at the north end to start with, and then do the south end later based on the impacts to the beach. We did the first phase, and then when we came back to do the second phase, the Corps of Engineers told us that the channel had moved down by the inlet, and that we didn't, and because of that, we didn't have enough material in order to do phase 2. So we went ahead and went through the permitting process of deepening the inlet, not to the complete width we wanted, just to do a kind of a trial run so we could back off of it if it did any damage. So we went and dredged the inlet to 150 feet wide and 16 feet deep, as well as doing the navigation channels to the core depth in those spots shown, and nourished the entire beachfront with 812,000 cubic yards. Then we went through the permitting process to go to the complete CSDR level for 2020. For 2020, obviously we got hit by Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Dorian, all during that permitting time. So we got quite a bit of funding from FEMA to help us out there, and it allowed us to really enlarge that project. And the total here, it says 2.7, but it was actually right under 3. The project that we did the part that we did associated with Dorian just isn't accounted for here. I apologize for that. After putting that in place, in 2024, we needed to do a navigation-based project. And we did another 1.9 million in 2024 as a navigation project, even though the beach was in very good condition. Again, one of the things about this program, and I like to call it a program now because we've been doing it for 14 years. It's not just a plan, it's been implemented, at least at the local level. Currently, the dune configuration and the beach configuration is where we were at in 1995, prior to Hurricane Fran, which was a whiteout on Topsail Island. We have put that much dune out in front. We built approximately 120 feet of dune. We have naturally accreted another 50 to 80, depending on where you are. And the dune that we built is also naturally growing vertically by 3 feet. We built it plus 12, and we're anywhere between 15 and 18 feet on the vertical on that frontal dune. Again, comparing shorelines, if you look, these two pictures are from 2011 when under construction, and again, 2024 under construction. You can see that we were placing material, and the high water line was right at the edge of those steps when we started in 2011. If you look to the, let's see if I can do this. Oh, no, I can't. If you look, you'll see that the steps are actually in that back ridge of dunes that we have, and we have not lost a set of steps in 14 years. At Topsail Beach, we're very proud to say that. And something I'll bring up in the future slide, we actually have put in legislation within the town that will hopefully prevent that any time in the future. Stewardship is something that we look at these projects, and most of the time we look at them as property protection. But we also at Topsail Beach have looked at this as stewardship, to try to do things that will benefit both the environment and the properties there within the town. One of the things the town has worked and the Coastal Land Trust achieved this year, we worked for about 6 years with the town and couldn't come to fruition on it, but Coastal Land Trust made it happen. We've put the southern end of the island into permanent preservation. There will not be any construction down in what is the real inlet hazard area forever at Topsail Beach. It's about 100, depending on the day, between 90 and 120 acres that has been preserved. Also, when we did the original project, we put in infrastructure under Drum Street and up under Queens Grant to the north. We put in permanent pipelines so we could cross from the back of the island to the front of the island without going through the critical habitat that is in Serenity Point. So we did that to as advantageous for the dredgers, but also advantageous for the environment. Those pipelines have, at the rate they've been pumped through, they have about a 60 to 80 year lifespan. At some point in time, long after I'm gone, somebody will be looking at replacing them. One of the other things we've done as stewardship in this is the town has gone through, and as Ken mentioned, talking about setback lines, and we're getting relief from the setback lines. What the town has done is we've actually put in to the town building code a permanent setback line that is essentially the visible line of construction. This is to prevent anybody from moving out onto the dunes. One of the problems with the static line we had when it was put into place, or the pre-project line, is that when you go from the setback on that, at the time, over 30% of the homes were non-conforming in Topsail Beach. If somebody struck a match in a house, it was gone and it couldn't be put back. Many of those lots did not have a buildable envelope, so you couldn't even put back anything small. So with this relief that we're getting from the pre-project line, all of the lots within Topsail Beach are now conforming, have a conforming building envelope, but we have set a town line that when you get a permit, you have to stay behind that line so that you can't move any further forward. Also, because we found that with the new dune, walking over the dune was not very hard, even for myself who has 2 artificial legs. We decided to put in a limit on how far out the crossovers could go. So they could only come down the steep face of the pre-project dune. The new dune is a walkover. And so we can never have beachfront stairs that will be caught up in the storm. They will always be behind the dune line unless we have a whiteout type storm. I'm sorry, one of the things that people will question is walking over the dune, doesn't that erode it down? But we've actually studied this over the past 4 years. The lines that you see there where people are walking over are actually where the dune hasn't grown vertically along with the vegetation. It's not that the dune has been carved down. So it's really interesting. We still have 12 to 14 feet in all of those places where it's been walked through. How much money have we spent over the life of this project? Over the past 14 years, we've spent over $88 million doing this through town resources. The town has done this without borrowing a dime. It's broken out here into, it's actually been 6 projects. It's broken out here into 8 different projects simply because we had money that was allocated for Florence, Matthew, and Dorian. And or Isaias, if you had to go through that process, you got to keep the pennies separate or it all gets confusing. We have put over 7.1 million cubic yards out there. Roughly 4 million of that is what we would consider initial construction. 3 million is maintenance over the past 14 years. Financially, the town has, we've gone through the cost estimates in 2011. We put out an estimate of what the cost would be long-term. With all of the different options that the town looked at, we are within 5% of that original estimate. And this is the estimate that we've put together starting with our 2023 project and carrying through 2054. Roughly, the town needs about 6.6 million that we plan to achieve both through town and county savings, as well as use of the shallow draft inlet fund as we have in the past. It annualized at roughly $6.6 million. Currently, the town puts 14.5 cents of its ad valorem into the BIS fund. That's roughly 30% of the town tax base. Room occupancy tax, they get $320,000 a year from that. And parking, they get $100,000 a year that all goes into the BIS fund. Pender County gives us $180,000 out of the general fund, and they return all of the ROT tax, which is approximately $640,000. This adds up to roughly $202,300,000 a year. When we go to construction, we have typically seen matching funds on the order of $5 million from the $5 million annualized from the shallow draft fund. We would look to FEMA where applicable. As you may know, the monies that they're being put away are actually greater than the amount that we talked about as an annualized rate. That is because the town, when we are doing these projects, not only do we need to perform the projects, but because we get reimbursable grants, we have to be able to cash flow. So the objective of the town is at any given time to have 2 projects worth of money in the bank when we start a project. And that way, not only do you have money to cash flow without borrowing, but you also have the ability, if a storm hits immediately after the project, to have money to go into a FEMA type restoration. With that, that is the gist of our program that we have there. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone have any questions for Chris or for Ken? Good presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner King?
Just the timeline.
So as far as how long do we intend to maintain it? We intend to maintain it perpetually. But right now, if you look at the erosion rates that we have, the shoaling rates that we have in the inlet, doing a project every 4 years, so our next project being in 2028, then the next one in 2032, 2036, we would be able to maintain this perpetually. Yes, sir. And we've actually, the costs that we've put in this are actually inflationary costs. It's not backing out to, dollars tomorrow, bringing it back to interest today and carrying it forward. It's actual real-time dollars we're looking at, so the town can plan appropriately with the ad valorem tax. It is all self-funding, and especially even at the state level, with it being through the shallow draft inlet fund, that's folks on the backside that are the boaters are paying for it through the gas tax. So yes, it's all self-funding. There's no federal funds involved. And the town has been one of the most proactive towns I've ever worked with doing this.
Thank you, Chris. Topsail Beach has done a good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Um,
Oh, interesting, just one last note. I found out the other day that Rutgers University is actually looking at Topsail Beach as a case study for how to do feature nourishment.
Nice.
So,
Larry?
Chris, great presentation. Most impressed with the financial end of it. That 6.6 million annualized as far as revenue for these type of projects. And that's exclusive of any FEMA money.
absolutely. There's no FEMA money that is anticipated in this. You're not supposed to do that. That's actually breaks the FEMA rules. So we do not have any anticipation there, but if we get hit with something major, then we can rely on that to come back.
Much stronger.
There's no further questions. At this time, a motion will be needed to approve or deny the Topsail Beach Management Plan. Commissioner King? Motion by Commissioner King, seconded by Commissioner Holman. All in favor? All opposed? It is unanimous. And Ken, please make note that Commissioner Smith is here. Thank you very much. And again, a nice, really envious beach plan. Really envious one. We need to notify Commissioner Hennessy that he can come back. That agenda item is over. If someone would yell. Next up, good morning, Rachel.
Morning.
Periodic review readoption timeline for NCAC 07B.
Wait for Jordan.
Yeah, I did it in.
All right, good morning, commissioners. My name is Rachel Love Adrick for the record. Today I'm going to present the readoption update on the 7B land use planning rules. As you will recall, in February of 25, the commission approved the rules to be sent to the Rules Review Commission. The Rules Review Commission met in June and they approved the periodic review report. And then the report was sent to the Administrative Procedure Oversight Committee. That committee did not meet, so the report became effective. So the rules are now eligible for readoption. The rules are going to be readopted with no proposed changes. And that's because we are currently undergoing a land use planning pilot project with the Resilient Coastal Communities Program to integrate the Resilient program into the land use planning program. We received funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we're currently working with Hyde County, Pamlico County, and Elizabeth City on that project. So today staff is requesting the commission's approval of this readoption schedule and approval to initiate the permanent rulemaking process. The schedule would be in 26, so rules would be published to the NC Register. There'd be public comment period from January to March of 2026. A public hearing at our meeting in February of 26, and then we would propose readoption in April of 2026. And then hopefully rules would be filed in June for the June Rules Review Commission meeting. And then the anticipated effective date of those rules would be July 1st, 2026. So if we receive approval today, we will prepare a notice of text and begin the 60-day public comment period, again, with the intent of having the rules readopted in 2026.
Thank you, Rachel. Does anyone have any questions for Rachel? If not, a motion will be needed to approve the readoption schedule and to initiate rulemaking.
I'll make that motion.
Motion by Neil, seconded by Jordan. Wait a minute, then Lauren seconded. Jordan, your question.
So we're not voting to approve the rules, is that right?
We're initiating the readoption. We've already approved them.
Okay, that's, okay.
And if we approved them with no changes and they sent them forward for rules review and then all the other agencies.
Okay.
And everything's gone cleared so far. So now we just have to readopt and start rulemaking all over again, the periodic readoption.
Right, okay.
Any further questions? Not all in favor? All opposed? It is unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cameron? Proposed amendments to 15A NCAC 07H.0306 septic tank seaward of the vegetation line.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Morning, Madam Chair, members of the commission. For the record, my name is Cameron Luck, and I'm here to present and discuss proposed amendments to general use standards for ocean hazard areas, specifically as it relates to the relocation and replacement of septic systems. Many of these amendments were originally proposed and approved by the commission back in April, I believe April 2023. The rulemaking process was delayed while staff prioritized addressing the rules pulled from the code by the RRC. At your April meeting this year, the Coastal Federation requested that the commission restart this process, so staff look forward to discussion today. Just to bring everyone back up to speed on the rules relevant to septic systems in the OHA, projects that involve septic systems are covered under the same rules that regulate structures. This includes 07H 0306, which is a rule we're talking quite a lot about these days, which is your general use standards for the OHA, ocean hazard area, and provides structure setbacks, limits on development in high hazard areas, and standards for relocating and removing imminently threatened structures. You also have 07H 0308, which are your specific use standards for ocean hazard areas. These include things like ocean control activity limits and includes allowances for sandbags to be used to protect both imminently threatened structures and their septic systems. CRC also has 07J 0210. That's your replacement of existing structures rule. This includes criteria for when repair on a structure becomes significant enough to be considered replacement or require a CAMA permit. With septic systems, staff utilize each of these to guide regulatory decisions. For example, the septic systems relocated or replaced with public funds must comply with CRC rule. Privately funded projects that cannot meet these criteria must still be relocated to the maximum feasible distance landward of the existing location of the primary structure. Systems that meet the criteria for repair under 7J 210 can be done in place without requiring a CAMA permit. So what are the issues? Under current rules, when a property owner wants to replace their septic system, under 07J 210, it's actually considered as repair. It does not require a permit. This is because DEQ policy considers considers a primary building, its HVAC system, and its septic system to be one contiguous unit that makes up the actual regulated structure. Normally, this would not be an issue, but in communities which have experienced significant rapid erosion, the vent septic systems can be replaced in their current location, even though they would otherwise not meet setback requirements. The concern is that while many of these houses have become imminently threatened and their septic systems fail, property owners still have the option to wait up to 8 years for natural accretion, beach renourishment, temporary erosion control solution, or the house itself to fall before taking immediate action under current rules. Depending on what a property owner chooses to do, a septic system could continue to be exposed to wave energy, potentially leaking onto the beach. During the initial rulemaking process, the CRAC voiced concerns over the strictness of CRC rule when an applicant considered using public funds for relocating a structure. CRC rule currently requires full compliance when using public funds. Although this discussion was initially started considering National Flood Insurance Program fund availability, which was later confirmed to be non-public, there's still concern that many property owners would not be able to reach full compliance should local, state, or federal dollars come available. As of now, non-public funds allow for maximum feasible distance landward from the primary structure if the property owner can't meet the setbacks. So with all this in mind, here we go and walk you through some of the proposed language. Majority of what you'll see here is what was included and for proposed and approved during the 2023 April meeting. However, since the rulemaking process has restarted, staff are considering some changes and are looking for your input and discussion on which direction this commission would like to go to address septic systems in the ocean hazard area. Starting with the 306A3, both staff and the commission at the time felt it was necessary to provide clarifying language for the types of development within the ocean hazard area that cannot extend oceanward of the ocean hazard setbacks. Septic tanks and their systems were not clearly defined, so staff have added the language you see here. That language is it includes a reference to the public health general statute defining septic tanks and their systems. Secondly, looking at 07H, 03, 06F, staff suggests maintaining the CRC permit requirements if a structure needs to be elevated or relocated. However, when applying 07J, 0210, which is your replacement of existing structures rule, work is considered a replacement if the department determines assessed cost to do work exceeds 50% of the structure's market value prior to coming into disrepair. Because DEQ policy has historically looked at these systems, the HVA systems and the primary building as one structure, this almost always removes an applicant from needing to secure a CAMA permit to replace an existing septic system. This includes replacing systems that are currently on the dry sand or wet sand beach. By adding the highlighted language, anytime a septic system requires replacement, the property owner would require a CAMA permit. And finally, for systems that must be relocated or replaced, this is currently broken up into criteria based on the types of funds that the property owner has access to. So for the use of public funds, property owner would still require to meet all the applicable setbacks in CRC rule. This approach was originally approved during the previous commission considerations and has been maintained by staff in this rule. But this is actually something that we want to open up for y'all's discussion later on in this presentation. Similarly, staff have kept the previous allowances for private funded projects or non-publicly funded projects that's written in rule that cannot meet setbacks to at least move structures a maximum feasible distance landward instead of meeting setback requirements. And I've also added language which you see here, which prohibits relocation of septic systems waterward of the vegetation line. So that would hold them off the beach. This is more restrictive than what is currently in rule and would not only pull systems back behind homes that are now out on the beach, but would also require them to be relocated at least behind the vegetation line. And like I said, that would keep those systems off the public trust beach. So this is sort of where we get into discussion. Very interested in y'all's input on this. We've set up a list of four discussion points, questions for you guys to consider. First, staff proposed language that would pull septic tanks out of consideration under 07J 210. Is that something that the CRC is interested in us doing? As a reminder, systems when considered under 0210 for repair and replacement are unlikely to need a permit since they currently considered part of the house or the primary structure. Second, does the CRC want to continue distinguishing between public and private funds or instead combine under one of the pre-existing criteria? Within that vein, when considering the relocation of septic systems, does the CRC want to include language that sets thresholds for properties that cannot meet setbacks? In the rule that was proposed, we chose the vegetation line. That's open for discussion. And finally, should staff draft language requiring the removal of failed systems when certain conditions or thresholds are met? And the question there is also, what might those criteria or thresholds be? Thank you. Look forward to the discussion on this.
Thank you, Cameron. Questions? Robert?
Do the health department have rules and guidelines equal to or more stringent than what you're proposing?
Hey,
So-
Rob, can you speak a little bit closer too? Thank you, so the audience can hear.
Do the local health departments have guidelines that are equal to or more stringent than what you're proposing?
So the Public Health Department, as I understand it, have rule language that requires septic systems to be sited at least 50 feet from mean high water, the surveyed line. You have communities where the beach has changed significantly since that line has been marked. That 50 feet could actually still be in the water or could still be on the public sand beach. So there is the possibility that it could be more restrictive, but oftentimes, given the erosion rates we're seeing in some of these hotspot areas, no, it would be less restrictive.
Larry?
Sort of the same line of questioning that Commissioner Hyde, what's the coordination? Because we don't permit and approve or inspect septic systems. And I think you're correct, on oceanfront areas, those are SDSC waters. And it's only a 50-foot setback by public health rules. This sounds like it needs to be coordination or maybe rule changes or agreement with an entirely different agency I would think the coordination would really get out of kilter, who's controlling location of septic systems.
I believe during the initial discussions over the course of the 3 commission meetings where rule language was proposed, there was, and I'll let staff correct me if I'm wrong here, but there was discussion on whether or not CAMA could include rule language like this. And the answer was yes, because it would be considered development within your AECs. But I do agree that there could be coordination there to try and maybe increase the strictness or that distance requirement or what they pull that measurement from.
Because naturally, with their pretty strict siting requirements for these waste treatment systems, and it's usually the better land is going to be towards the dunes.
Right.
A lot of times it can fall off into almost wetlands on the backside of a lot, be in an unsuitable location. Whereas the better site would be, and that's where I'm talking about the coordination of that between agencies as far as strict oceanfront setbacks versus the best site to locate these type of waste treatment systems. And that's a big concern of mine on that, but it's the other one is when you say the setback on the vegetation line, is that like a pre-project vegetation line, or is it, if it's a renourished beach, which setback?
So that's actually a conversation that Ken and I were having this morning, more in the vein of the hybrid vegetation line we're currently talking about. And one of the things that we wanted to actually bring to you guys as a question was, that's sort of open to y'all's discussion, which you would like to use, because some communities have a measurement line, development line, pre-project vegetation line, personalized stable natural vegetation. The way that the ocean beach is defined as a general statute 77-20, which was in, that language is in the previously proposed rule language that you'll find in the memo. The ocean beach it's defined through various different things that different criteria, potential criteria to define the landward edge. One of those is the vegetation line. And so that's why we use that language here.
Jordan?
On the part with the public and private funds, what are some examples of where public funds have been used for moving or with the septic systems?
There's no examples that I have right now, but the discussion, as I understand it, when the CRAC was having these talks, where they were based on the NFIP funds, there was an assumption that those were public. The clarification was that it wasn't, but we wanted to continue to have this openness discussion because there was concerns that if local, state, or federal funds became available, that there would be a potential limitation.
Follow up.
Mr. Emery first, then you have a second.
Yeah, I'm just back to the vegetation line.
Yeah.
Is that the equivalent in this case of first line of staple natural vegetation?
Yes,
Okay. So as long as, the way this rule is written, as long as this waterward, it can't go any.
it can't go waterward.
Waterward
Yeah, of that
than
line.
the first line of staple natural vegetation.
Yes.
And could I ask,
Well,
yeah,
yeah, Robbie?
I'm just gonna walk off the regional treatment. One, and I'm good. Why would our rule stay based on this thing?
So that's been in rule for a while. It's been in rule for a very long time. I think I don't know for sure. I believe the argument there is if public funds are going to be utilized, the project should meet the rules as they're written. I think that was the idea behind it. You can use public funds, public dollars. The project itself should meet the criteria of the rule as it's defined. That's my understanding.
Or the rule is possible or good.
And
Does that change why?
so the Coastal Federation, when they asked to revisit these rules, did not specify why. But I believe the original discussions came about because in communities like Rodanthe, where a lot of the conversation was about septic tanks on the beach when these houses became imminently threatened. Some of these systems and properties that were getting close to being imminently threatened or were imminently threatened were looking at ways to move their septic systems so that they could potentially still utilize the property. And so my understanding is we were asked to revisit our relocation rules, replacement rules. And in some cases to try and make sure that those systems weren't just being replaced on the beach as they are, which is a public trust area.
Jordan?
I have some issues with the fact that we're separating out public and private funds. You're treating one class different than another class just based on funds. And
Yeah, the public health was there at that meeting and they talked about a little of their limitations, but I think as it evolved from the working group, I think some of this came about. But we need to get that information to the commission.
Not sure that it might help if you like someone from Department of Health Services or something to come give us an education on this too. That'll clarify a lot of things.
Okay, an invitation. Did you get that, Cameron, an invitation?
I'm writing it all down.
Okay, thank you. Neil?
In response to Commissioner Hennessy's comment about difference between public and private funds, I think the impetus or the original reason for that is when using public funds, you're held to a higher standard than an individual homeowner might be with regards to costs or other, issues related to not just septic tanks, but any other time public funds are, applied to a project of some sort. And typically, if it is from a federal agency or state agency, they're going to have their own restrictions applied to the use of those funds anyway, too. So I think that might be the primary reason for the separation in rule language between public funds being used versus just individual private homeowner funds.
Thank you for the clarification. I think you're right. That was part of the discussion about grants and so forth. There usually is a lot more paperwork and standards to meet. Everybody okay about moving this, Cameron?
Can I add real quick? Ron has come up here and is willing to shed some light on the discussion about the coordination with the public health side of this.
Okay.
For the record, my name is Ron Rinaldi, District Manager in Elizabeth City Office. The two homes that are shown in this picture were located at the end of Beacon Road. What you're seeing there in that system is, in this picture, is a septic tank that was actually newly installed and washed out. these two homes, lost their septic tanks. And they got, exemptions to replace them. They replaced them in place and then they were washed out. After that, they did get permits to relocate the septic systems, the maximum feasible distance landward on these lots. Now, the lot lines, were still pretty much on the flat beach. And what they did is they relocated the septics, that maximum feasible distance landward. The day after the house, on the left in this picture, the septic was washed out within 1 day. We did coordinate on these permits with the health department and, we're all scratching our heads saying, how are you guys allowing these to be, authorized back here in this area? And their marching orders is, if they are given a, plan that has mean high water identified on it, showing that 50 feet, that the septic's outside of that and is stamped by an engineer, they can't question it.
That's right.
Even though we're all looking at it and seeing that the high tide is landward where the septic systems are. So we did try coordinating with them on that, and it was gonna take rulemaking, changes on their part, to change that. Which we really didn't get the impression that that would be successful. They didn't seem to think that it would be successful. And you're right, Renee, this did come up in the early meetings of Breton Workshop where they were present and they spoke to that. That's a kind of a little bit of a shed on the light of where these rules, where this all started. It was because of these two homes at the end of Beacon. These two homes are since gone. They were bought by the Park Service and torn down. Now, with the current rate of erosion, those houses, in my opinion, would not be there anymore, regardless if the Park Service would have bought them or not. Y'all are familiar with the Knights and Rodanthe home, Serendipity. That home is just to the west of the left house here. And at this time, there was 70 feet of dune between that house and dune line. It's gone now. The beach is up to Serendipity's stairs.
Yeah, it's for sale.
What's that?
It's for sale.
And it is for sale, you're correct. And I'm guessing they're not getting any buyers.
There's always, you never know.
Yeah. But that I wanted to come up here and just give you kind of a little bit of history on that. The situation that kind of spurred all these proposed changes.
Thank you. And I do recall the conversation with Public Health that day that they were not positive that they could enact any changes, that they had to live by if that day they went out, there was some dry beach there, didn't matter what happened on the next tide, they had to issue a permit. Bob?
Now, I was just gonna say, I think it was, one reason we got started on this was we saw pictures like that. And had reports that due to their, they're doing what they're supposed to do. They've got their rules to go by. But their rules ended up putting septic tanks on the beach. And that's why, I think why we got into this.
Jordan?
It was kind of a situation where we were looking for them for help and they were kind of looking for us.
Jordan?
Appreciate you pointing that out. That's helpful to have that background. Just a couple questions. So when were these pictures taken or?
2021.
21, and then they were moved in what, 23?
Part of them bought them, tore them down.
So these are the two that they bought. So when you say they need to change their rules, you're talking about the Division of Public Health.
The health department, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean,
And again, their 50 feet is based on that mean high water line, which is based on the datum that is a surveyed line. But that, like specifically in Rodanthe, that beach is so dynamic, it changes day to day where that line. So even though the septic is more than 50 feet away, it could still be in the circle.
I think it was the Coastal Federation that brought this to us, right?
We had tabled it because well, we're in the middle of COVID as well too, so a lot of stuff didn't get done. But yes, they asked if we were going to revisit it and asked us to revisit it.
Can someone from that group talk about any conversations with public health?
I don't know who's here. Braxton. Yes, good morning, Braxton.
Trying to hide in the back.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all
morning.
for taking this up again. And Renee, you have a great memory. That was the first time I can remember it being discussed with public health there was at Fort Riley when we were kicking off that joint effort to look at threatened oceanfront structures with the Park Service and DEQ. And we actually had the public health folks were on the interagency work group that helped write that report. And so they were very active in that discussion. And there is some discussion about this issue in that report as well, that David Alex mentioned yesterday. Yeah, they've taken the position, I think they even have a reference to the CRC in the rules somewhere. Just kind of, they handle it their way. I think personally, I think that we should also look at their rules, but keep in mind, the CRC is regulating based on things that other agencies don't. So you're looking at oceanfront erosion, just like stormwater infrastructure. There's stormwater permits out there, but stormwater infrastructure on anywhere in an AEC is also regulated by CAMA. So you're regulating for different reasons. And I think that's where this is very similar to that. I think that it fits well within CAMA. Dave pointed out yesterday that there were, I think he said 16 septic tanks lost in the last 6 weeks and another 15 that were unaccounted for after the houses collapsed. And what we saw that Ron pointed out was just this rapid, replacement of systems that are in really bad shape in a lot of these places. So we would love to see this move forward and happy to answer any other questions.
Any other questions from the commissioners?
Just follow. So there hasn't been any conversation really with them or any proposed rulemaking from them?
We are planning to pursue that this coming year and separately, and I totally agree. It'd be great to have them kind of aware and involved in anything going forward on this.
Just a comment, I think it'd be, instead of everybody working in silos, trying to, work in one, might be a better process, get a better rule, better product.
Thanks for the explanation on that, especially bringing up this hot spot. And I just think we need to keep it in context. Nobody wants this, no question about that. And it needs to be answered. I just, when you change rules, though, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you got a hotspot problem, let's deal with it. But we're setting rules for the whole coast. And so it has to be balanced, in context of the problem. I know with the health department system, it is a 50-foot setback for the mean high water mark. That is surveyed, measured, engineered, whatever. And I don't know how these type systems got approved. To me, it's unacceptable. But their rules also have a flooding provision. I think if it floods once every 5 or 10 years, that's also a site unusable. So again, I see this, for this to be effective to try to correct these type of problems, it's going to take some coordination with the health department system to get their rule agreement. And that's why was my original question. The coordination is going to be a nightmare if we're going to be regulating the whole coast, or a very bad problem. It's going to create a bureaucratic nightmare of coordination. And I think it has to be done somewhere.
Commissioner Emery?
But however that turns out, I don't think we want septic tanks on the dry sand beach. And I think that whatever we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen is something that we should do. But I think it's great to coordinate and check in with sanitation.
It is my opinion also that this commission needs to do something to prevent these scenarios. And it may cause some bureaucratic problems up and down the coast, but we've got to protect our natural resources better than what we're doing right now with these septic systems that we're losing almost one a day in some situations, so. Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Hall?
Thank you, Commissioner Andrew. I absolutely agree, and I think that, again, to try and, keep some movement on this subject, I would, say that going back to the 4 questions that Cameron presented, we need to all walk away from this meeting thinking about those 4 questions and come back prepared in February to better discuss them. Have someone from the HHS here with us to talk about what I see as a clear gap in protecting the public health and the public resource.
Commissioner Knight?
And if Braxton and his organization can be beneficial in the same meeting, in coordination of what they're proposing next year, I think all in favor is the being present at the same time.
Commissioner Brown?
I'm just like to ask the area to expand a little bit. Brad, nightmare. Exactly. How do you see that? How do you see it being a problem for them? But
Well, it's, my former life did a bunch of that type of work, and it's quite a process to get sites approved with the health department system. They're fairly strict, and it's, this situation, I don't understand how those permits got renewed, regardless. But if, in the permitting process, I mean, that can be a holdup in itself, just trying to get sites approved for waste treatment systems. And it's not like, all land is created the same, soil's created the same. There's going to be 1/4 of your lot that may be usable for waste treatment system. And especially on beachfront, now the health departments, basically, they're going to have to coordinate with CAMA to see if it's in a mandatory setback zone for CAMA purposes before they can do their job. That's where I see the bureaucratic nightmare. There's 100 counties, each county's got its own health department. They interpret the rules differently. And it's, with the 20 coastal counties, I see it, you'd have to coordinate with all 20 counties. It's all regulated through Raleigh, through state regulations. But some of the counties have their own regulations. I just see it as being quite a bureaucratic mess to try to coordinate with our rules.
DR?
so I'm just asking, trying to understand the process. So on a new house, is the permitting process,
DR, speak a little bit closer to your microphone. Thank you.
is the permitting process for a new house the same as what the proposed new rules might be, or is it different?
And that's another good point. The health department rules have a lot of exemptions for lots, I think platted before 1979. There's reduced setbacks, reduced property line setbacks. This is very typical with beachfront lots, which a lot of them are fairly small lots and would probably meet all those grandfathery exemptions that are in the health department rules. And that is a whole nother layer of whether waste treatment systems can be put on a piece of property. And this is going to add another layer of actually eliminating particular areas exclusively from even being looked at. It'd have to be done up front and coordinated with the health department systems that if it's oceanfront, this area, you can't even use that area. They're going to have to start from that line landward. It'll be in sort of excluded out as far as even being considered, even though it may be the best site for waste treatment system.
I think this rule does not include new construction. It's listed as relocation and replacement.
Yeah.
For those systems that are basically washed out and so forth. Just one second. Robert was next, and then Robbie, and then DR.
I think Larry is correct and complicated even more. believe some counties have their own, health, septic department, septic approval, septic rules, and some counties, you go hire a specialist that designs your septic, present it to the county, and it's then just signed off, call it his signature.
Yeah, those engineers can sign off on a system. That's true in just about any county, but basically my understanding is that they're all under state authorization, even though they're basically county employees. Robbie?
Just my thoughts. I know I'm doing this. But already we have regulations in place that would not allow them to build a house under those conditions. No house, no need for septic. My recommendation is that we leave it alone. I understand that if the health department wants to approve it for improvement or just for them to move it, why should we interrupt that and make the homeowner go through more checks and problems, make it more complicated? I understand we're trying to protect our resources, our natural resources. But like I said, once again, I think we already have rules in place that would keep that from being rebuilt. Why would we revisit this? I recommend we don't.
DR?
Larry, I had a question for Larry, really about and I understand what you said about the new versus old. My question was whether if somebody's gonna get a permit for a new house, do they not have to go through this process of, getting a septic tank approval for the health department as well as meet our rules?
I would say yes. Jordan?
Looking at those pictures, obviously no one wants to see that. Where else are we seeing that type of rapid, one day washout of septic systems in the state?
Buxton would be another recommended area.
Outside Dare,
It's happened in South Nagsett too.
outside of Dare County. I mean, we got 8 counties that border the Atlantic, and we're saying one county's got all these issues. So are we aware of any other issues in any of these other areas of the state?
I think part of this process is we have hotspot areas where significant erosion is occurring. We all know where those places are, but this discussion should also, in our mind, consider down the road, other communities that are not currently indicating these sort of issues, but they may, 10, 20 years down the road.
I hear you, but we're looking at today's problems, trying to look to the future, and I'm just trying to get a picture of where these other issues might be, but it sounds like it's primarily just Dare County.
Well, one
I mean,
second.
'cause we're talking about oceanfront here. We're not talking about.
One thing that I would point out is a lot of communities have central sewage. Not all counties use septic tanks. There's an awful lot.
Correct, so that,
Especially the southern counties have.
right,
central
but that
sewage.
needs to be considered too, that they don't have septics.
Lauren?
I would just remind you that we had 35 requests for sandbags at our last meeting. I mean, erosion is happening. It's happening a lot. It's gonna keep happening. So I think we need to think about it now.
To Commissioner Hennessy's question, there were a few on figure 8 as well, septic systems that were needed repair due to erosion.
Last question for me. Do we keep track of how many of these that we've had washout issues with? I mean, Dave talks about it yesterday that, I mean, he had over 16 or something, and that wasn't even including the houses that collapsed. So I think it'd be good to try to keep a track so we can have an idea of a number that we're really, it's a problem.
Yeah, we could probably gather that data.
The data's there. It just has to be gathered back.
Sure, but I'd like to know what the data is.
And we know we're bringing this back at our next meeting with some other items that have been mentioned. Can we wrap this one up and know that we're seeing it in February?
Right.
Seeing no dissension. Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you.
We knew this would not be an easy subject. It wasn't when it was started at the initial meeting at Fort Raleigh. Morning, Greg.
Morning, Madam Chair, and members of the commission. You give me a second, I will try to find my presentation.
This is proposed amendments 15A NCAC 07H.0308 sandbags, an alternative sandbag design for protection of public roads.
Again, good morning, Madam Chair, members of the commission. Again, for the record, my name is Greg Bodnar. I am the major permit coordinator for the division, and I'm here to present to you for discussion alternative sandbags. This kind of fits in very well with the discussions that we had yesterday with threatened structures and different ideas and options that might be available. So I'm here again to present for discussion some information that we have from the division or from DOT and concerning the alternative sandbags that have been previously authorized through your variance process. For a quick review of the temporary erosion control rules that you have in 0308B2 for sandbags within the ocean hazard area. They're for imminently threatened roads, right-of-ways, and buildings and associated septic systems, and they are limited to sandbags at the mean high water and parallel to shore. Specifically for this discussion, one of the points that we are looking at is within 07H0308B2L that sets the dimensions and color of individual bags. And those are tan in color, 3 to 5 feet wide, 7 to 15 feet long when measured flat, and a base width not to exceed 20 feet high or 20 feet and 6 foot high measured from the base of the lowest bag. In September, NCDOT came to division staff to discuss this particular subsection, and they provided examples of locations where these alternative sandbags that we're calling have been granted through CRC variance. And there's been 3 locations. One was on NC12 in Ocracoke, and that variance was granted in June of 2020. Merlot Beach was the second one. That variance was granted in February of 2022. And the final one in December of 24 was the Pea Island Visitor Center. These 3 locations utilized all the same alternative sandbag design. They were trapezoidal in shape. The sections were 50 foot in length. They were white in color, and they were open topped. So they were a little bit different than they went for the variance for those particular portions here. You can see a representative design of what those trapezoidal sandbags were. Like I said, they were 50 foot long, and within there were baffles sewed into each one of those 50 foot long sections. Just quick. So with those 3 spots, oh, is there a question?
What was the height?
The heights varied. They can be the ones I'll show you here in a little bit. I think each one of them was 6 foot high. Most of them have been varied between 2 foot high to 6 foot high. Some of them were 4 foot as well. Each individual, and I'll kind of mention that later, they're proprietary. So each one of these designs can come in different sections and different sizes. The particular ones that they've used here were 50 foot long. I believe they were 4 foot and 6 foot sections in height. So kind of going over each of the individual variances that you provided. First, talk a little bit about the 2020 variance for NC12. That variance had a total of 3,281 linear feet of sandbags. They were originally authorized as traditional sandbags, and then in 2020, DOT came in for a variance to use those alternative sandbags in about 1,948 linear feet of that overall 3,281 linear foot authorized section. This area was located in hotspots along NC12 in Ocracoke towards the South Dock Ferry Terminal. And during recent installation last month, they added these alternative sandbags that were authorized through that variance or granted through that variance in 2020. And most recently, when they installed those alternative sandbags, they also repaired some destroyed and damaged traditional sandbags. The next section that we had that was installed and varied in 2022 was 50 linear feet around Merlot Beach in Rodanthe.
This was at the terminal end of what was NC 12 after it was rerouted over the Jug Handle Bridge in Rodanthe. And you kind of see here a little bit of those different designs that they might have for each one of those 50 linear foot baffle designs. They can get 2 foot high, 3 foot, 4 foot, and 6 foot high sections. Also want to bring to attention these alternative sandbags and these particular designed alternative sandbags are filled through a little bit of a different design than what normal traditional sandbags are. They utilize a scaffolding. A lot of times these particular sandbags are filled with dry sand from the area, from the beach, or trucked in and brought in. So you kind of see that design of how the methodology of how these alternative sandbags are filled. And then finally, the most recent variance, which was done in 2024, was for Pea Island Visitor Center. That was for approximately 1,100 linear feet of sandbags. They were started just waterward of the road at below grade, and they installed 2 different sandbag sections. One was 4 foot high and one was 6 foot high. Then they rebuilt the dune and vegetated part of it. And you can see on the right, these sandbags are not without issues. This year we had, during the hurricane season, brought us 2 hurricanes that ran parallel course to the Outer Banks. And we also had additional coastal lows and surge events that have impacted these specific alternative sandbags. The picture to the right, like I said, was taken in October during those storm events. You can see what is actually road in the foreground, though it is covered with water at the moment. You can see the 2 stacked alternative sandbags and then the ocean immediately waterward of that sandbag alignment. As you can see on the left is what it was when they installed them. On the right is what it was after those storms in October. And with the loss of that dune, these alternative sandbags have been undermined, and they were actually open topped. You can see the design, and I'll show you that again here. You can see that they are open topped. So with that open top and the loss of the dune that was covering these sandbags, they lost sand out of the top of the structures. And with that, they were slumping forward and slumping oceanward in this particular alignment. So with the loss of the sand and the underminement, they were moving and slightly slumped oceanward. DOT is currently looking at options to repair and modify these sandbags to deal with the issues here at Pea Island, and staff is working with DOT to provide them with guidance on any options that they may have. So as mentioned before, in September, DOT met with DCM staff before these storms, and they want to discuss options for revising rule language to allow more flexibility to protect public roads. The more flexible design options could provide DOT with additional approaches to unique road alignments and situations that could occur. And DOT further indicated that sandbag designs, like I mentioned before, are proprietary. So there can be similarities in these proprietary designs. Individual designs could have some distinct differences. Things like materials, installation techniques, and color could vary between the proprietary designs. So with that, DCM, with that request that DOT provided us and requested for us, we came up with some draft rule language to present to you to kind of start the discussion to see if there were any particular thoughts and ideas kind of moving forward. So with that, and to assist your discussion, we drafted standalone subsection O to your existing 0308B2 language for sandbags. And the subsection O removes the tan color and the individual size bag limitations, yet retains the overall structure, base width, and total height. And like I said, this is a standalone design, standalone subsection here in O. And with that, Madam Chair, that's the end of my presentation, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Greg. Questions for Greg? Sheila?
I assume that the timing on this is pretty, kind of as quick as we can take rulemaking action, right?
They did not request an expedited or emergency. Moving forward, they are well aware that if they have to use these alternative sandbag designs, and like I said, since they're proprietary, they use a different alternative sandbag, there may be different uniqueness associated with those. They are aware, though, that kind of moving forward until any language is adopted and put in rule, that they would have to continue to go through the variance process. And we'll do anything we can as staff to, expedite that as possible.
Gordon?
So there was 3 variances they asked for previously, right, to use these types of sandbags?
They've asked for multiple variances, yes.
But to use this special type, right?
Yeah, all 3 variances in I believe it was 2020, 2022, and 2024 used this particular sandbag design. Yes.
One of them they didn't even do, right?
The original one in 2020 for NC12 and Ocracoke, they received the variance, but they did not install them until the past couple months.
Oh, in the past couple months, okay. So are they effective? Have we received feedback from them on
Yeah,
that?
right now, and I'll kind of go back, right now, they're kind of a mixed bag, and of course, it really kind of depends on the situation. 2025 has definitely been a unique year with, 2 storms that didn't hit us, and the surges and tides and things like that. So, this is probably on the far end of the spectrum of what you could occur, but if you get a direct hit, something like this could occur as well.
But if they leave them open, it appears that they're not going to be very effective as the ocean overwash comes over, the sand's going to come out. Sheila?
Well, I just wish there's some way to know how would a traditional sandbag structure have fared in 2025? I mean, does DOT have any kind of modeling to try and mimic that?
Yeah, we don't have anything right now on NC12 and that 2020 variance, that 3,281 linear feet. About 1,900 of that is alternative sandbags, which they've just placed. And there are traditional sandbags adjacent to that within that same alignment. They did not put those sandbags in, I think, until late October. So it might have been after this recent storm events. So we do have an opportunity to look at that. But I don't know if we have any data specific to this recent impacts and how the traditional and the alternatives fared.
Neil?
So in the interest of allowing the DOT some flexibility and giving them some more tools in the tool bag to assist in this very treacherous stretch of highway, I would like to make the motion that we accept the proposed language and move forward with the next step in rulemaking as presented.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any further discussion?
I had a couple more questions, but so when you go back to the rule,
Yes.
you're taking the color out and the size is staying the same though.
The individual size, the individual dimensions of the bag is being removed from this, but not the overall shall not exceed the overall width and height is not changing. And that was per discussions with DOT, what they were most concerned with. If you remember, those alternative sandbags were 50 linear feet long. So that's a little bit different from what your current rules state. And of course, the color is different as well.
Well, I'm just thinking if we were going to provide this for DOT and this rule is for DOT, right?
When we were in discussions with DOT, the specific parts that they discussed with us was the individual sandbag dimensions and color. They didn't bring up the overall width and length of the larger structure.
But the ones that they asked for a variance on were 50 feet long.
For the individual size sandbag, yes. Not for the overall size of the structure.
Motion's on the floor. Larry?
Quick, the materials they use for these alternative sandbags, it's essentially the same material they use for other sandbags, do you know?
I believe so. It might be a slightly different polyethylene blend and all, which may be the reason why the colors are different. But I'm not exact sure on what the chemical makeup is between the two.
Motion on the floor. No public discussion. All in favor? All opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, ma'am.
One more item and then we'll take a break. Rules review objection and proposed amendments to NCAC 07JH .0508 Jockeys Ridge AEC. Good morning, Daniel. We ought to know this by heart by now.
Yes, so I'm not gonna go through the amendments, and all of that, and those boundaries or anything. But I do want to go through the options and what the statement goes. So, as I mentioned yesterday, you all have adopted the amendments that we have made to Jockey Ridge ABC. We drafted that in 3 parts to your reference. It was, A, the description, B, the boundary, and then C, the use standards. But on August 27th, the rules will be objected to those amendments, specifically in paragraph A, description. They felt like the description was unnecessary. It was not the same as a designation as required under General Statute 113A-113. With that being said, you all have until December 1st of this year with 2 options. You can amend 7H0509 to address Rule Review Commission's concerns, submit that revised rule for review, or you can not respond with no response, and basically that means the rule will come out of code. So if you do decide to amend the rule to address RRC objection, staff has come up with this proposed rule language. Basically, what we're doing here is we're pulling out the description language. We added the designation word, and then we moved some of that descriptive language down into the boundary section. So we no longer have a description language in the rule. So that we believe will satisfy the rule that you can put. Without concluding, happy to answer any questions or what you are requesting me.
And this description just became a problem in August. Amazing. Amazing. After 4 years. Questions for Sheila and then Jordan.
Daniel, thank you. Has this language been shared with RRC attorney, and do we have any indication of the acceptability of the changes?
Sarah.
Yes, this language has been submitted to RRC council. Again, RRC council, just like I don't speak for all of you, RRC council doesn't speak for the RRC, but they have reviewed this language and they thought it was acceptable. They didn't have any questions on this language. For what it's worth, again, I don't have the fatigue with this rule that many of you do because I am new to this commission. But again, as Daniel said, that the main issue was with the description of it being the tallest sand dune along the Atlantic coast. And so staff has reviewed it and I've reviewed it, and we feel that this still gets you where you need to go, but maybe responds at least to the current objection to the RRC path.
Jordan.
That was pretty much my question, was whether this has been shared, or when they objected, they in the meeting say why their objection or provide any feedback, any suggestions.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, they objected, basically saying that the description was unnecessary. And that it wasn't required under General Statute 113A-113. That was basically the response.
Commissioner King, did you have anything? Sheila?
I make a motion that we amend the rule as proposed to address the RRC concerns.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by DR. Yes, and Commissioner King. Thank you all very much. Any further questions? Larry?
Just for clarification, the AEC will still be intact.
That's a good question. So the rules, the judge has ruled to put the AEC back in, the old rule back into the code. But we, during that time, we decided to amend it to clean it up a little bit through that process. So this, in our view, was a cleaner version, and that's why we were proposing this. So to answer your question, if we were not to amend this to address RRC, the old original rule, which has the description language in there, would still be the code, but that was for a judge's order, correct, sir?
And that is under appeal.
Yes,
Yeah,
that
so
is my
that'd be-
understanding from litigation counsel, and litigation counsel who is working on the litigation was also part of all these discussions, was at the RRC meeting, talked to the commissioner about this rule, and has reviewed these changes.
So, so if, this is probably a question there, but, so if the courts rule with our old rule and we change this rule, would the old rule go back into effect?
The old rule is still in effect right now per a judge's order, and that's where the litigation is still being held up as the RRC has appealed. This is a new version to try to satisfy us going forward too.
And so I think I know where you're going with that question. So if it were to stay in the code after this field and this gets adopted, we would appeal the whole. We'll request an appeal to get it out of that.
So, sometimes we major in the minors, don't we? But if it'll move forward, make them happy.
All in favor? All opposed? It is unanimous. We'll take a 10-minute break at this time.
Yeah.
Room got quiet pretty quickly.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and members of the commission again. For the record, I am Ken Richardson, Division of Coastal Management. So today, I've got technically two presentations that I'm doing. With the inland hazard area boundaries and then talking about transition into the erosion rate piece. But these kind of travel together. So both studies are based on three reports. One is your science panel report on updating boundaries. And then there are the two erosion rate reports, one's for the ocean front and one is for the inlet. So there's three separate reports, but everything's going together at the same time. But before I start, I also want to recognize that your science panel chair, Dr. Laura Moore, is here. I'm going to try to best represent what the science panel is recommending, but if I get something wrong, I want Dr. Moore to sort of jump in and correct me, or if you have questions specifically that you want to ask your science panel, she is here to handle that. The commissioners submitted some questions and responses to the DCM. We provided that in your memo. I don't plan to go through the itemize and talk about each of those individually, but what I will do is kind of roll those into my overall presentation. So as I go forward, some of the things that were asked in there, will touch on, but I'm not going to specifically point to that question or comment and then address that specifically, kind of in a specific order. So one of the things that I just noticed too, with the rule amendments in those two separate packs with the IHA and the erosion rate, something weird happened to, I believe it was the erosion rate memo where I think 0310, everything was stricken out in there. So I'm not sure what happened when we were editing and staff was reviewing and edits were accepted, but something weird happened there in translation. So I think the one that's in the IHA memo is better reflected than what we're talking about today, but there's no decisions being made or actions being taken on those, but I wanted to make sure that those two look a little bit different, and I don't understand what happened in one and versus the other. So yesterday, before the commission adjourned, I think that was a great opener to kind of, or lead into the discussion on IHA boundaries and erosion rates. So when we're thinking about coastal hazards, you have to identify where you're doing a risk assessment. Look at where your vulnerabilities are. And so doing the IHA boundary updates and erosion rate kind of fulfills that kind of sets that baseline. You're identifying those areas that are potentially affected by the risk, which are erosion. That's not a guarantee that you're going to see those, but it's just you're identifying those areas that potentially could see them. And this kind of serves as that baseline. Anything beyond that, and you're thinking about being resilient, might involve other things other than policies. Keep that in mind as we go forward as well. My outline kind of covers both this presentation and the erosion rate presentation coming up next. And so I'm not going to do a total review of what you saw in August. What I want to do is take some of the key points away from that and provide some context that will talk about the necessary rule amendments that would be required to update the boundaries and then also update the erosion rates. And then the same thing when we talk about the OEA, Ocean Erodible, and the IHA, getting those erosion rates updated as well, and necessary rule mentions are required. And eventually we'll get to talking about, your science panel recommended using the hybrid vegetation line for measuring setbacks from the IHA. So we'll eventually get to that point, but I want to kind of let you know that there's some build up to get there, just to review the key points from August and to provide that background context when we start talking about the rule amendments and why those will be necessary. You may recall that there were 10 inlets analyzed. Your rules are meant to regulate development. So these are the 10 inlets where we have development. You may have noticed that Masonboro Island, there's no development, but there's a couple of privately owned parcels of land. And the same thing with Lee Hutap Island. There's no development currently there, but because there are private parcels that are privately owned, those were included in the study. So unless those will become total 100% state or federal lands, then we'll just keep forward with updating those. And I've listed those. My brain, I've done this so long now that I work from south to north. I don't have it's not a reason. That's just how it goes. So when you look at this, as I talk today, just know that I'm talking starting south at Sunset Beach and going north up to Carteret County. One of the things that was proposed in the last study in 2018, 2019, and this, again, because your rules pertain to development, currently there are inlet has varied boundaries at these inlets as well, but because there's no development, and for the sake of resources, if the science panel did not revisit these and did not update them, the staff will be recommending as we go forward that those current IHAs at those inlets be taken out, at least, and there's some of those where there's an IHA being proposed on one side of the inlet on the Ponce River, but then on the other side, there's Camp Lejeune, there's no development there. So on one side, there would be a recommendation versus the other side would not be. So I just wanted to remind the commission of that. So just to review, I wanted to provide the maps that show the current inlet hazard area, which is the yellow dash line, and your science panel's proposed updated, which is the yellow box. And one of the things that I did on the last update of it is I provided you a land area in terms of how much the boundary either increases or decreases. But because that not everybody has the same width of the beach, not everybody has the same marsh conditions. Just factor in area that doesn't make as much sense. So what I decided to do this time is just give you a structure count inside the boundaries. That way you know relatively comparison to today's IHA compared to the proposed IHA, what that means in terms of structure. And as we move forward and get to the point of doing a fiscal analysis, we'll get more in detail looking at the structure. Because of everything's not the same, and this is a visual thing, I know you kind of start to see the first couple of slides, the structure count box is going to appear in the bottom left and others that may appear in the bottom right. So just note it's going to jump around a little bit. So at Tubbs Inlet at Sunset Beach, the boundary is reduced in size. Currently, there are 206 structures inside the IHA. In the 2025 updated boundaries of 17. So there'd be a reduction in 189 structures on the Sunset Beach side. We jump over to the other side of Tubbs Inlet on Ocean Isle. There are currently 41 structures inside. As you can see, the boxes of the boundary is a little reduced. So that would bring a few of those structures out, make a total of 30. So there would be a reduction of 11 structures on the Ocean Isle side of Tubbs. Jump over to Charlotte Inlet. You'll notice this is an example where the current IHA isn't really relevant to today's conditions. It pretty much sits inside the inlet or on dry sand beach. So that's why there are no structures. It's not that there's nothing in that IHA, it's just it's not relevant to the existing structures. So there's an obvious increase in the number of structures that would be inside the proposed boundary. Jump to the other side, there are currently 59 structures inside. Inside the proposed, it would be 144, so there'd be an increase of 100, or an increase of 85 additional structures inside the IHA. So some of those on the landward side would actually drop out of the current box. And newer structures coming in to the new boundary. We moved to Lockwood Folly at Holden Beach. Currently, there are 4 structures inside the IHA. With the 2025 proposal, there will be 42. So there'd be an additional 38 structures in the inland hazard area. And one of the things you probably have noticed that as we go forward, you'll see that the boundaries in some cases, and this is a great example of it, where the landward boundary of the IHA really pretty much stays the same as that 1979 boundary. But if you look along the shoreline, that's where you see that extension that goes a little bit farther. And so as we get into the talking about the rural amendments necessary, the current rural amendments focus a lot on inlet migration. So this is not a migrating inlet, but we do know that the inlet has an effect along that shoreline farther away from the inlet than was recognized in the 1979, because that's not something specifically that study looked at. Keep that in mind as we go forward as well. Jump across to Oak Island at Lockwood Folly. Currently, there are 43 structures. There'll be 105 included in the proposed for an additional 62. Again, this is another example where really the landward boundary doesn't actually decreases a little bit, but it's that along shore boundary that is extended a little bit farther away from the end. Go to Carolina Beach. Currently there are 0 structures in. That's because of the boundary. It doesn't extend along the shoreline as far down towards the development. So there will be 18 structures included in the proposed for an increase of 18 structures. Again, Basin Rural Island, there's no structures now in the IHA. Wrightsville Beach, there's not an IHA at the Mason Borough Inlet on the Wrightsville Beach side now, so that's why there's no structure there in that one, because there's not one. But there would be 3 structures in the IHA recent proposal. We go to Mason Inlet at Wrightsville Beach. There's currently 1 structure in Shell Island Resort. With the proposed boundary, there would be 16. So just an increase of 15 structures. We go over to the other side of Mason Inlet at Figure 8. There's 36 structures inside the current IHA. It would be reduced to 10, so the reduction of 26 structures on this side. Jump across to Rich Inlet at Figure 8. There's currently 36 structures inside the current IHA. There will be 62 in the proposed. So increase of 26, would have 26 drop out on the Mason Inlet side, but then we would have 26 additional structures on the Rich Inlet side. Lee Hutap Island, we see those used to be Lee and Hutap Islands. They merged, and so that's why you see the yellow dashed line is kind of sitting in the middle, because there used to be an inlet there, Old Topsail Inlet. So now the boundary just covers the extent of the island, because both of those inlets belong to that shoreline, but there are no structures there. New Topsail Inlet at Topsail Beach. There are currently 177 structures in the IHA. With the proposed, there would be 17, so there will be a reduction. 160 structures. Go to North Topsail Beach at New River Inlet. There are currently 84 structures in the IHA. There would be an increase of 125 with the updated IHAs for a net increase of 41. And finally, at Bogue Inlet, at Emerald Isle, there's currently 96 structures in the IHA. There would be 77 in the proposed for reduction of 19 structures. So if we look at the size of the IHA, and look at this table, we see the current IHA, there's 783 structures. We look at the updated IHA, there's 866. So your net total of structures in an IHA would increase from updating your inlet hazard area boundaries to an additional 83 structures. So you have some drop out, you have some come in. So in a net total, there would be an 83 structure increase inside the new IHA. Rule limits would be required, and there's some that would just be a minimal rule requirements just to update the boundaries. And your rules in 07H, 0304 define ABCs within the ocean hazard area. So inlet hazard areas are defined in 0304-2. And to update your IHA boundaries, you would need to reference the science panel's report, but also because we, instead of using the adjacent oceanfront rate, and find that inlets, you would also have to add a piece to reference the erosion rate report as we go forward. So currently, just to show you at how 0304 is currently written, where I highlighted the top box. This is where I'm talking about the current definition of an IHA doesn't quite define how the IHA was delineated with the most recent update. So we're talking of this area extends landward from the mean low water at a distance encompassing an area within which the inlet migrates based on statistical analysis. So that's not necessarily pertaining to how the current or the updated boundaries were analyzed, and shall consider such factors as previous inlet territory, structurally weak areas near the inlet, and external influences such as jetties, terminal groins, and canalization. So when you think back to that Tubbs, the reason why that boundary was so big, that Tubbs Inlet on the Sunset Beach side is because it didn't consider that factor of the former location of an inlet. So Tubbs Inlet was in that area before it would be located in the 70s. And so that was included in that boundary. And so we saw that too at Topsail Beach, at New Topsail Inlet, where those channels were also included because that was kind of a structurally weak area. So that was included. So that wasn't necessarily based on an analysis, but it was included as part of that too. And that kind of was a part of the factor that went into the 2018, 2019 study as well. When you look at the math on it, and then also consider the kind of underlying geology, inlet channel, hard structure, and that kind of thing. Whereas this study focused primarily on looking specifically more at statistical analysis based on what the shoreline had done in the past. So the second highlight refers to the current report. So that's the area that I said we think that he changed. So this refers to the 1978 report, which has a report and the maps. And so this would have to obviously be amended to reference the most current report. But this hasn't been touched in a while. So also staff will be, we'll look at proposed amendments to kind of clarify things and reorganize this as well. So to give just an example of what an amendment to this rule would look like, we can see the definition. These are areas vulnerable to severe erosion driven by the dynamic nature of ocean inlets where natural processes can undergo rapid shoreline change as the inlet movement redistributes sand along the adjacent beaches. Through the combined effects of wind waves, current dredging activities, nearshore bathymetry, and erosion control structure. So that kind of factors all that in, but it doesn't focus specifically on this inlet migration. And then the part A of 304 would reference the erosion rate report. Part B would reference your science panel's boundary report. Part C would reference the minimum setback. So just like on the ocean front, it references, the erosion rate setback factor should be no lower than 2, because your minimum setback factor is 2 times 30 to give you 60. Then the same would apply to him. So if you have an accretion, you're just would establish your minimum setback. And then part D would just reference having the link to get to the data or the report and the maps. And I know the erosion rate piece is scheduled for this afternoon, but if the commission wishes, I will certainly take some questions, but then I'll just roll into the erosion rate and get to where we get. But just know that also the reports, the data can be viewed. It's on the division's website. If you're a GIS user, you can download the data, you can consume a web data service, pull that in. So everything should be available on the division's website. So I'll take some boundary questions. And Dr. Morgan, back you up.
Ken, before we get into that, because we're going to need to have some IHA discussion. The CRC yesterday at its meeting asked a lot of questions about grandfathering, exceptions and so forth. And that was part of the reason that they did not give us a recommendation yesterday. Given that, and we're not through with this discussion by any means yet, would the commission, I believe I'd like to appoint a committee, subcommittee to look and work with the CRAC to answer some of those questions along with staff and bring that to the next CRAC meeting. Therefore, their recommendation can then come forward to us at that next meeting. So, I know Bobby's here somewhere. There you are. I'm sorry. My eyes are weak this morning. If Bobby, if you would chair that committee or you would designate a chair of that committee and have a couple members, I'd like to appoint Commissioners Emery and Smith to that committee representing CRC. And then your charge is to answer the questions by the CRAC, include those in a report that would come back to us from your next CRAC meeting. And hopefully with a recommendation to move forward somehow on inlet hazard based on CRAC input. I'm not trying to preclude any discussion by the CRC today. Questions for Ken. I know Commissioner Smith has some comments and questions. I'm sure other people have as well. So before we move on to the next area, Ken, let's work on this inlet hazard area. Earl, would you like to start? Would you like to start with your concerns and questions about the inlet hazard?
Yeah, one of the things that.
Wait a minute, we got to get your microphone better. Got to get your microphone better so we can hear you.
And one of the things I would be interested in understanding is when this 2025 report was done, what efforts went into going back and looking at the previous recommendation and determining how well that one's performed as you put together this, because this one uses the same process and stuff, basically to get there with a couple of changes.
Right, well, the key is it's the newer data were added and it's not the exact comparison. So the landward boundary is going to be different because it may be affected by the hybrid vegetation line. So it's not a one-to-one apples to apple comparison. So you kind of almost have to dig a little deeper. So you couldn't put one map. So you couldn't put up Ocean Isle in the 2018-19 study in 2025 and do a comparison and say, well, how did it compare? It's not built the same method. Even though the science panel used that same method to kind of get started, there was still that adjustment to the methodology to get there.
If I could just piggyback on that, Laura Moore, the science panel chair, for the record. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So
Closer.
if I understand, you were asking about, did we compare what we found with the prior report? And I think I heard you say because our methods were the same, but they weren't the same. We used a different approach because we really took the charge seriously in terms of we heard that there was a desire for a more objective approach that didn't rely on professional judgment. And so we really went back to the shoreline data, which, as Ken said, there was additional data in this process that wasn't available because we were 7 years ago. And then we also used a methodology that added another step so that it was more statistically robust and did not rely on professional judgment. So I think it would be difficult to compare because it's not apples to apples. We both have more data and a different approach at the request of the panel.
Yeah, I saw what you did with that and I'm happy to see that. What I was interested to see though is the linear regressions that set the erosion rates in the, I think it's 2016 version. or whatever that year was, 2019, whichever it was. Those set an expectation of where the shoreline would be in 2025 based on those erosion rates that were calculated in that prior report. And so what I was interested to know is if you took like the 2025 shoreline, computed what the linear regressions told you that would be, and then did a standard deviation against where it actually was and what those.
To what end?
linear regressions would tell us.
I guess I wonder, the linear regression, sure, you could extrapolate it into the future, but we have many examples where that you don't necessarily believe that that's exactly what will happen, right, in the future. So, we didn't look at where the linear regression would project the shoreline to be because we have shoreline data that tells us where it was. And so we just use the linear regression to come up with that average shoreline erosion rate, which is kind of like the rainfall forecast for the year, right? I mean, we know we get 50. We could take the total rainfall over a year and divide it by the number of days in the year, and we're not going to have that much rainfall every day. And so the linear regression really just gives us that average rate. So I would say we could have done that, but I don't know what that really would have bought us because we have the data and we wanted to actually use the data available. That makes sense.
The other thing I want to
Have more to add.
add is, and I'll go into this in great detail, but you have to know that this is not a prediction. It's not a forecast. It's not anything, it's not a model. This is strictly looking at the long-term trend of shoreline data position over time. So I'm not doing anything but other than looking at where it's been in the past. How do we apply that in policy? But we're not forecasting, we're not predicting because we know that you can't do that with rain. And there's no way we can do it with shoreline because there's any more dynamic factors that will.
You can get a general idea, but the idea was to use the actual erosion.
Well, I understand that, but you're using those linear regression rates to calculate a, and there's an inlet hazard area of the landward boundaries, for instance. And that is
I see where you're going with that. I mean, I think it's the best we can do is to use and that's why we use a longer period of time, right? We go from 1970 to 1924 because the longer the period of time, the better representation you get of what might occur because you're not looking at just a short time period where it was really erosive or really accretional. And so we're not intending that to be a prediction, but it's the best that we have to give us a sense of where there's the greatest hazard. So,
yeah, and what I'm looking for is just to see how good that sense of where things will go is.
I would say that even if we made that comparison, that doesn't tell us about the next future, right? Because sure, maybe it was great in some areas and off in others. I would say if you did that same exercise going forward another 5 or 10 years, it's going to work well in some areas and less well in others. So I'm just not sure that we would have gained much by doing that, although I understand the concern.
One question I think I wanted to verify, with the landward extent of the inlet hazard areas, if you're still using the hybrid vegetation line, that's the only use you're making of that when these.
So in the study, the only use of the hybrid vegetation line was measuring that landward boundary of the proposed IHA. So the discussion that we had at the CRAC was, Simon kind of recommended using that line to measure setbacks. So that discussion will continue as we move forward. But in terms of the study it's just the landward boundary of the IHA.
Okay, so the recommendation is not to start doing, construction setbacks from inlet hazard, from the, hybrid vegetation.
That is the recommendation, actually. That is the recommendation. And Ken made a really great point as he dove into this a little bit more, that on the areas, on the side of inlets that are where there's erosion, the hybrid vegetation line is nearly coincident with the vegetation line that you see today. There's really not a big difference. Where you really gain benefit using the hybrid vegetation line is in the areas where the inlets are actively accreting, because we know that where there's accretion now, we're likely to see erosion in the future. And so if you go out there today in an area that's really created a lot in the last 10, 20, 30 years, and you were to take a setback from the current vegetation line, and then erosion starts again like we know it will, you will end up siting homes in an area that will be subject to significant erosion, and you'll have houses on the beach, which is a scenario that we already know is difficult to address. So you could think of the hybrid vegetation line as really analogous to a pre-project vegetation line in an area where a beach nourishment is being undertaken. So you measure the pre-project vegetation line, and then construction is relative, setbacks are relative to that line, unless the beach nourishment project goes on long enough and there's a program, and then you say, okay, well, we can make an adjustment to that. But I would argue that we don't have a sense of how long the inlet is going to take for the course to be reversed and for erosion to pick up again. So you really never want to, in the science panel's opinion, go back to, you don't want that current vegetation line to be what you're using for setbacks, because it's just not representative of the range of change. I think the other key point is that hybrid vegetation line is the landwardmost position of the vegetation line during the period of study. It is not the most landward extent in history, because we only, started in 1970. There are places where the hybrid vegetation line, if we were to say, well, measure it from 1920 forward, it would be even farther back. So it's already relatively conservative. But so the panel is, again, as in 2018, strongly recommending the adoption of the hybrid vegetation line to measure setbacks, knowing that you're then going to need to that you'll undertake a process to grandfather existing structures, and that it can be dealt with that way. But at least then you're communicating the true hazard by saying there's this hybrid vegetation line.
Okay. Bob?
I was just gonna say that will be a focus, I believe, of the group that Renee has put together, is the use of the hybrid vegetation line as a measurement line. That's what that group is going to be talking about.
Sheila?
And I just wanted to, what Bob was saying. I think that Bobby yesterday during the CRAC meeting did an excellent job of delineating the technical work that was done by the science panel, and a lot of the questions about if we as a commission decide to embrace the recommendation of the science panel to use the hybrid vegetation line, then the work of Bob and Earl and Bobby and the subgroup will look at those policy questions and bring those back to us in February.
Jordan?
For clarity, if the property is put into an inlet hazard area, what does that exactly entail?
Ken?
So I'll tell you what, if a lot of what we're talking about now, actually, I'm going to cover some of it in this next presentation, because the first one was just the boundaries. So this will be about the erosion rates and what the setbacks are. So if there's something, if we want to talk about erosion rates and setbacks, how the vegetation line, what that might look like, how the measuring setbacks, I do want to cover that in this. That will help. But otherwise, it's going to go for the next presentation.
Okay. If there's no more questions right now, or do you have any more comments on this one? We're not taking any action on the inlet hazard day, but do you have any more comments or questions? Or are you going to save some of yours for the committee as well? Okay. I'm sure the committee will have very robust discussion.
Well, and I'll just say one more thing about the HPL. I mean, I think I started to say this, but you could almost think of inlets as performing a very long-term, infrequent nourishment that you don't know when it will erode away. And so, that pre-project line, HPL being really analogous to one another. I hope is a helpful conversation.
Ken, proceed. I'm sorry, Sheila.
This is excellent.
Wait a minute, one second, Ken. Sheila.
I apologize, Ken. Can you go back to I think it was the next to last slide, your IHA presentation? I apologize. And while you're doing that, I just want to express my appreciation for the science panel's work on, all of the rework, reanalysis to get us to where we are today. And just appreciate that volunteer effort.
They are. Sheila, is this the slide you're looking for?
Yes, so at the top, the inlet hazard area, I just, and I'm being lazy, I don't have my laptop here with me. Is inlet hazard area defined in current rule, legislation, or that definition? Just want to make sure that I understand, are we working with, this is the legislation and it is what it is, or if there's, changes?
It's defined in your rule. I mean, there are pieces in, it that were passed on to the commission. But again, this is just to give you a sound bite of what section of the rule will need to be addressed. Just update the boundaries, but in terms of just cleaning up, reorganizing the rule, that's one of the things that staff would be recommending. So, but at a minimum, the public altering the definition that's in your current rule, you need to probably do that so that it's more specific to the proposed boundary, and then reference the updated report. And so some of the pieces and parts that were handed to the commission were like the existing part A, where basically we're talking about the closure of Matt Inlet and doing away with the IHA at that one. So that was kind of given to the commission, where it states that it refers to the boundaries in the 1978 report, and are incorporated by reference and are hereby designated as inlet hazard areas, except for the location of a former inlet, Matt Inlet. So that it used to have an IHA, they closed, and then there was some things going on, and then there was some intervention, and that IHA went away. Or inlets that due to shoreline migration no longer include the current location of the inlet. So we've got examples of the current boundary that due to erosion or migration, that boundary sits in the inlet. So technically that boundary would fall out. So just in cleaning up that, we want to kind of reorganize it, kind of redefine it to fit the modern approach to analyzing inlet hazard areas. And so we'll get to the end of the erosion rate sheets. I'll revisit this because there's pieces and parts that lock into both the ABC definitions and the erosion rate updates. Just kind of consider this as just a quick soundbite of what the new boundaries look like in relation to the current, in terms of how many structures we're going to be in those. So as we get into the erosion rate piece, then I'll start talking about setbacks and that kind of thing.
Did you have a question, Jordan?
Back on the boundaries, it looks like with the pubs, inlet, quite a bit of accretion change.
That tub at Sunset?
Yeah. The dotted line was what was done in 1979, right? And then what we're looking at is what you're proposing. So all those homes that are right now in that dotted area were in an inlet hazard area, right? And they were built in an inlet hazard area. And they were built in an inlet hazard area.
They were built in inlet hazard areas. So it's important to note that your inlet hazard areas don't prevent development. It's just preventing, you're trying to regulate size and density. So the inlet areas are more prone to a greater risk of erosion. So the idea of the commission was like, it's different than the oceanfront. So size and density is kind of where the regulation went.
So how did they get it so wrong back then?
What's that?
How did they get it so wrong back then?
Well, the inlet used to be located exactly on that I guess southern side there. That used to be the old location of the inlet. Bill was well, it closed and then reopened farther north. So in the current definition, look at, you know, your inlet migration, but then it also looked at the former location of an inlet. And it was, so where all those houses sit, that used to be the inlet channel.
Roger. So what is working so well there to make it, accreting land and everything?
So what's making this a creepy? That's a great question. So, I just got this from an email. There's multiple factors going on. We've got the dual jetties at Little River Inlet. We've got the closure of Mad Inlet, and then we had the closing and reopening of Tubbs Inlet. Believed to be the primary drivers affecting the accretion along Sunset Beach and you have to think about, these are significant factors, and so when you change these, those changes don't occur overnight. So as these things change, it does take a period of time for this area to figure things out. Where you've got an inlet that closed, you've got one that now right now this inlet's getting really choked up. You got Jeeps Creek almost closed up. Channel is shifting away from Ocean Isle and going towards Sunset a little bit. So a lot of dynamics are going through this area, but because of the closure being so deadly, Tubbs, these things collectively.
So what, do you know when those jetties were put in? The dual jetties you're referring to?
I think it's that 7. I don't have that number.
Okay. So the jetties were put in prior to that inlet hazard area assessment.
So get jetties called first, followed by relocation of Tubbs, then the closure of Madden.
So a channel alignment is what you're thinking is what's helping.
What I was just going to add briefly is that I think you're seeing a big difference between the current inlet hazard area and the proposed inlet hazard area in a lot of places because it's been a long time since the inlet hazard areas have been updated. So there's going to be difference because it's been so long. So if this one goes through and then you do an update in another 5 years, I wouldn't expect you're gonna have dramatic differences like this. I mean, we know that inlets shift and change, and we tend to get erosion on one side and accretion on the other, and then that flips. And there are just a lot of complex processes that lead to sand moving on shore in some places and being eroded in others, and often has to do with the channel alignment and where that channel is located. And that's why the inlet hazard area is important to define. So I think we showed some videos that I think that presentation is available. That might be useful to just think about this flip flop that occurs. And I just wanted to highlight that the differences are large because it's been since 1979. So we could bring this into the present day. I think you would see it'd be easier next time because we will have already made this big jump that brings you into the 21st century with your eyes.
All right, Ken? I'm sorry, Larry.
Since this hybrid vegetation line is a crucial parameter to the way we're forming these new inlet hazard areas, could you give me a 5-second elevator ride, common man definition of hybrid vegetation line?
That's coming soon.
Okay.
And that's presentation, I'm gonna visit that, just because I know that some folks remember what that was, but I do want to remind the commission.
Good.
So I will definitely go for
Thanks.
that.
All right, Ken, go ahead.
And when the commission's ready to stop for lunch, just tell me to stop. So even just looking at the on cover slide, very interesting shoreline. That's that Portsmouth Island at the front. You see that the shoreline can look like it's been put in a blending, depending on where you're at. Not all parts of North Carolina have this type of shoreline in response to storms, but this is a North Carolina picture. My first erosion rates, we kind of talked about it, but I think it's important to emphasize this because some of the questions I've received from property owners, there's some misunderstanding of what the erosion rates are telling. What their erosion rates are telling us is that this is the calculated long-term trend based on historic shoreline position. And that's all that we are getting out of that. So what they are not predictions based on modeling, calculation, or even estimating. Another thing that's very important to recognize is this long-term trend it may not reflect short-term changes at all. I'm going to demonstrate that in a minute. And so we look at places like Buxton and they say, well, our erosion rates are not high compared to what we're seeing today. And that's because the long-term trend is the baseline there. There's kind of that underlying baseline, but it doesn't always reflect what's going on in this 5-year cycle or 10-year cycle. So I want to provide some examples to kind of illustrate that. Just recognize that this is not a prediction, and it's not going to necessarily reflect the long-term or the short-term fluctuations that communities may see. So when you look at a rate that's 3, you know, hey, I'm seeing 20 feet of erosion per day. That could happen. Just like a rainfall, we get 2 hurricanes in 1 month, that blows that average rainfall. So if we look at this graph, look at the points on the graph, that represents shoreline position relative to time. No math involved other than just plotting those on the map. And if I tell you nothing more, all right, I want you to just draw a line through those points. Do your best. But I gave you the information, said, all right, if the line generally, if it slopes downwards, that represents erosion. If it slopes upward, that represents accretion. So without doing any analysis, you could easily look at that and say, all right, yeah, those points are pointing down, so that tells me that represents an erosion. So the 2 methods that we looked at, and these are methods that are academically applied, professionally applied, and the U.S. Geological Survey in their digital shoreline analysis system. These are 2 primary mathematical tools that they incorporate in there, looking at calculating erosion rates using endpoint, using least squares regression, which falls under the umbrella of linear regression. But what those 2 do is they give you that long-term trend. So I said, linear regression basically best fits a line that represents, it tries to fit a line as close to the actual points as it can to represent the data set. And that's the red line. So the slope of that line is going to give you the rate. If you look at that dash line, that represents the endpoint. That's what the state has used since 1979 to do the erosion rates. And what we've seen even in this study, that endpoint and linear regression generally gave us that same long-term, what I would like to refer to as a baseline trend. That's the long-term trend. Now, if we look at the first few points, starting in like 1970, your earliest shoreline, and go to about 1990, those points are generally linear relative to the data sets that appear after 1990. But once we get to 1990 to the current day, we see that if you pick any 2 points on there and draw a line to connect the dots, you have either a yearly, every 2 years, or maybe a cycle. You can pick a 5-year window or a 10-year window, and I think there's even one for a 15-year window. Some examples I've got on there. You can easily come up with super high erosion rate or super high, or at least a rate of accretion. So when you look at the state's rates that we're putting out there, we're talking about the long-term trend, and the linear regression is a method that is applied in many different studies, and to include in Town of Ocean Isles, Beach Monitoring Report, their engineering consultant in linear regression to measure shoreline change there. So it is applied academically and professionally. It's very common, but the state's rates are based on that long-term trend. So this is an example showing that you're going to get those short-term fluctuations, especially in a very dynamic area, like an inlet or a place where the erosion rates are very high. You get those changes, or you're doing beach nourishment. And if you build a house in one of those places where you can meet the setback, and then you have a 10-year cycle or 5-year cycle where the erosion rate shoots through the roof, then you get folks who are in trouble. So your setbacks are designed to look at what's the long-term trend, and as best we can have some sort of setback based on the long-term trend, and hope that those short-term fluctuations don't just blow the long-term trend out of the water and put structures in danger. But that's the reality of living along the Atlantic shoreline. So the purpose of the study is to update erosion rates and the erosion rate setback factors in the landward boundary of the OEA. And so we go through this process about every 5 years to try to incorporate the latest data. It may not be the perfect, but it's incorporating the latest data, but also then try to incorporate that into measured setbacks. FEMA, National Flood Insurance Program, Community Rating System. The fact that the state updates its erosion rates every 5 years, communities in doing CRS can get 50 credits applied to their CRS, which in the 2013 study actually benefited the towns of along both banks. And so that 50 points is actually going to make a difference between them dropping from one tier to another, which would have affected their flood insurance. And then the newest, we update the has various boundaries and doing setback erosion based on inlet erosion rate. Not going into the details, again, the methods that we've used in the state, additionally, we've used endpoint that looks at 2 shorelines. We're moving to least squares regression, which looks at all the shorelines. We try to exclude post-storm shorelines, and as best we can, we try to avoid post-nourishment shorelines. But given the amount of nourishment that occurs along our coast now, it's tough to be totally avoid those two. But again, we did a comparison of the two methods just to see how those relate to one another. As you may recall, so this is a recycle, but I think it's what we're re-emphasizing again. The raw data are statistically processed through a smoothing, and then that smooth data gets translated into block segments of the shoreline. And the reason why we do the smoothing is for this type of scenario here, where you have shoreline cuts, where one house may have an erosion rate of 10 feet per year, you go 2 doors down and they've got an erosion rate of 2 feet per year. So those cuts were not permanent features along the shoreline. They're going to move up and down significantly. So smoothing helps to filter out this. And if the shoreline is generally linear, then smoothing is not going to have that effect on anything like this as an example. So shoreline is more straight, then smoothing is not going to affect the erosion rate. Here, like I said, depending on where the transect falls on those cuts, they could have a effect. And so smoothing the block data then allows us to block sections of shorelines that have similar erosion rates. And we have blocking rules so that we try to not increase by a factor of 1 if possible. But when we get around inlets where we have erosion rates start to really accelerate, it's not always possible. So the transition from 2 to 3 to 4, sometimes it may be 2, 3, 5, 7, 5, or we'll see examples of that when we get to actually looking at the changes. Just a quick summary of those results again, 318 miles of oceanfront shoreline, over 10,000 transects spaced 50 meters apart were analyzed. This graphic just shows you the shoreline where the red represents where we had measured erosion, the green is where we had measured accretion. And again, just to compare, because we're wanting to transition from the endpoint method to the linear regression method, because given the amount of shorelines that we now have in our database, just to give you a comparison of what those look like. And we see, if you look at the endpoint and least squares regression, it doesn't really change things much at all. Look at the endpoint column, we get down to measured accretion, we have 109 miles, 34.3%. Jump over to the least squares regression, we've got 99 miles. Look at measured erosion, 208 versus least squares regression was 218. So we kind of can go farther down, look at range with setbacks and how they translate in comparison in there. But we can generally look at that and say, all right, it's generally gives us the same long-term trend, regardless of the method. Now, if we want to look at linear regression block erosion rates in comparison to previous studies, we can then further see that they still are relatively consistent with what we've seen with past studies that we use the endpoint. Now, we want to break it down a little bit more and just look at, all right, just where we see erosion, the average erosion rate was 4.2 feet per year. If we want to look at sections of shorelines where we had accretion that was measured, the average was 3.1. But statewide, the average came out about 2 feet per year. That's consistent with the study that we've seen in the past. And that's why your erosion rates are based on a factor of 2 times 30. 2 is kind of that statewide average, and then 30 based on the life of a mortgage. And that gave you the 60-foot setback as a minimum setback. Now, this is a graphic that you saw at your last meeting. We focused just strictly on developed shoreline, how this update affects the developed shoreline. About half of North Carolina's oceanfront shoreline is considered developed. It's a little bit less than half. 124.9 miles, we'll see no change in their erosion rate setback factors. 17.7 miles, 12%, we'll see a decrease in their erosion rate setback factors, and then 2 miles, we'll see an increase in their erosion rate setback factor. And I did show this at the last meeting too, to show you where we see an increase. But ironically, I've had more interest in where we're seeing decreases this time. But usually in the past, it's been where we're seeing increase. And by increases, I'm talking about, this is the erosion rate setback factor. So on average, the erosion rate setback factor increases at these locations, either a half foot to 1 foot. Typically what we see, that's super consistent. Actually more conservative than some of the increases we've seen in other studies. But just to run through again, just to demonstrate where we do see those increases, these transects represent red is where we're seeing the increase, green is where we're seeing the decrease, and gray, that you may not be able to see, is where we see no change at all. South Beach and Bald Head Island, we see a half foot to a 1 foot increase in those sections. Jump to North Topsail, there's a little sliver where we see a 1 foot increase, but then we also see a little decrease where it went from 3 to 2. This is actually a slide that created a little bit of a question. Given a lot of the issues that Buxton is currently undergoing, so we have to all kind of jump back to that graph that I showed, that had the points that showed what the long-term trend is. But then we have a period of time where we see a lot of fluctuation, and then we also have to factor in there's a lag time. So when I analyze shorelines, my most recent shoreline is 2020. The rates don't come out in 2020. There's a lag time because I've got to analyze those. And then in this time, we work with science panel, working the boundaries updated, but then there's the rulemaking process, the rulemaking process. So the most recent issues that we see may not be captured in this data set necessarily. So don't feel like when we say 2025 updates, we're including data that's up to date in 2025. It may be a couple of years old. So there's a little bit of a lag time just that process to go through. But where we do see a little bit of an increase is about where the former lighthouse location, and again, this is the erosion rate setback factor. The green, we see a decrease. Now, I didn't emphasize this the last time, but I think some folks locked onto that. For this range of beach, the erosion rate setback factor ranges between 5 and 10 feet. For oceanfront, that's a huge erosion rate. That's not, that's an enormous erosion rate. So by saying decrease, note that they still have high erosion rates. It's not it's a decrease, all things are good. But those decreases are still, it's about a foot. We can translate the erosion rates into the erosion rate setback factor. If we look at those ranges, it's still relatively compared with a relative to what we've seen in the past. So it doesn't change. The decreases or increases are still consistent with what we've seen in the past. Nothing surprising, no red flags there. But again, short term can be very different than long term. And erosion rate setback factor range between 5 and 10. That's on the ocean front. That's waves and road damage. We have small increases, decreases as well. Roll up few sections of beach where we did see a 1 foot decrease in the erosion rate setback factor. In the northern part of Currituck County, Rolla, another 1 foot increase. So to compare where we've seen increases and decreases going from one study to the next. The red box represents going from today's setback requirements to the updated. And if you want to look down that, you can see previous studies, when we've gone from one to the other, you can see that the increases and decreases are smaller in some cases, but they're consistent with the previous studies. So with no surprise, like, oh, things are drastically lower or things are have increased significantly. It's generally staying the same, even though we're talking about using a different mathematical calculation. It still represents the data that put into it. It still represents the long-term trend that we're seeing. Now we're inlet hazard area and erosion rates. Again, these are the 10 inlets that were analyzed. The science panel. We saw this slide the last time, but since we're talking about areas in setbacks and who will be affected, and then I'll transition into how does this affect if you measure setbacks from the current vegetation versus the hybrid vegetation. So I felt that going back through this slide was very important as well. So here I've not included the current boundaries, I'm focusing on the proposed IHA. When you look at the erosion rate setback factors in the proposed IHA, it's the same as it's always been, 2 feet per year, when the accretion there. So no changes other than they get smaller boundaries, but the erosion rate setbacks would still be consistent with what they've seen in the past. You jump to the other side, this is the first place where your current rule, remember that the adjacent oceanfront rate is applied inside the IHA. And so here's where you see your first effect of that. On the tip there, Ocean Isle, we've got the erosion rate setback factor of 10. And it transitions very quickly, but you also have to remember that they have erosion control structure, sandbag structure there that's kind of locked that shoreline for a period of time. Now we have some additional changes going on at that time that will influence that rate as we go forward as well. If conditions kind of continue as they have been in the past year. Jump to the other side. We see that the setback factors start at 2, if you go on the western side. And so we had a gentleman talk about this in the public comment section this morning. He said, well, the erosion rate should be lower now because we're growing. We just don't have enough data yet. I highly suspect that there's no doubt in my mind that that structure is going to influence the erosion rates for the better or worse, depending on the side of that inlet you're on. There's no doubt that those rates are going to be affected by that structure. But right now, the erosion rates that you're looking at only factor in one shoreline data set post construction of that structure. When we see it at other places, we can be thinking about Masonboro, Hamilton, we have navigational data, but we've got tons of data to support, well, the calculation results in a input here. But this is just an example of, it's a new structure, we just don't have enough data yet. There's no doubt there's going to be an effect on both sides, like I said, either for better or worse, depending on the side that you're on. But time and additional data are going to be needed. One of the things too is that I need to put a lot of emphasis on, I've heard some chatter about it, is that, well, you look at the state's erosion rates, right now the setback requirement in the IHA is 5 feet per year, but if you look at the proposed setback, erosion rate setbacks, they really increased. Please don't interpret that as being a direct impact as a result of that structure, the terminal growing structure. The erosion rate setbacks were based on the inlet erosion rates up to 2022. Again, this is a good example of showing where the adjacent OEA rate gets applied inside the IHA. So if you look at that table where I've got the arrow starting at that point, at that setback factor of 10 yellow boxes, connect the dots, that's about where the current boundary starts. So whatever that rate is on the ocean front, got applied inside the IHA. So the greatest that it got was 5, even though we did measure rates that were higher than 5. You kind of cap it at that point there. So now we're looking at erosion rates based on shoreline change at the actual inlet. And then our data set stopped here at 2022. So again, we're only looking at one shoreline post-construction. So please don't interpret going from 2020 to the updated rates, but the structure itself is what's causing this. This is more of how the application of finding that adjacent rate is applied inside the inlet. So I wanted to really emphasize that. I know I kind of heard some chatter on that, and I believe it pointed out yesterday too. I think in the variant, but I just wanted to clarify that this is not tied to the structure. Not saying there's not issues on the inlet side of the structure, but the numbers that we're seeing there don't represent the effects of the structure. Jump to the other side, setbacks are generally the same. You wrap into the inlet, there's no development of the erosion rates there based on inlet rates again. We go to Lockwood Folly. When we see that the rates are actually a little bit lower compared to what they've been in the past. Jump over to Oak Island at Lockwood Folly. No change there in terms of the erosion rate setback factor. It still will remain at 2. Carolina Beach. Because we're only looking at the study period is from 1970 to current. That drops out some of the more oceanward shorelines, so the erosion rate setback factor is actually 2, so it will actually be reduced relative to some of the previous setback requirements. Like there's not really any development in the current boundary there, so it didn't really impact anything. The rights to the beach side, setback factors 2, and this is an example where we do have tons of data and where the shoreline has been stabilized, generally stabilized as a result of the leaky navigation jetty there. But you got to kind of have that data to support the long-term trend. Go to Mason Inlet at Rice Beach. Setback factors, still remain the same. Jump over to figure 8. Mason Inlet, no changes there. The rate remains consistent with what we've seen in the past. We'll move over to Rich Inlet on the other side of figure 8. We do see a little pocket where inlet erosion was measured. And I think Rob Mayer's had some images to show you some of the structures that are having some challenges there related to erosion. And I believe this could be the general pocket where those are at. So that little increase in that little pocket, that's not surprising. Topsail, that new topsail inlet. This is your one accreting or one migrating inlet in the science panel study. They stay the same. Jump up the New River. Again, this is another example of how applying the adjacent oceanfront rate to the IHA has affected the erosion rate setback factors in the past. So there is an increase at this inlet starting at 2, and as you wrap into the inlet, the erosion rate setback score 15. And then we end at Bogue Inlet at Emerald Isle. Erosion rate setbacks remain the same, 2 feet per year. All right, so now we're going to start getting into what it means for talking about setbacks, and this is what we'll talk about what it looks like relative to the height of the vegetation line. So this is a graphic that was shown yesterday at the CRAC to give you an idea of the size of the boundary and how many structures are included in those boundaries. The pink box represents the number, or pink area, the number represents number of structures inside of today's boundary, 783. The yellow represents number of structures that would be in the proposed IJ, 866. So if you look on the far right, you've got some negative numbers that represents them. In those communities, how many structures are going to be taken out of the IJ, when the others represent a net increase for those communities. So overall, there'll be 83 additional structures in inlet hazard areas developed through today. So when you think about size, you see that boundary extended along the oceanfront, you think that's much farther away. Start doing the structure map. Some communities you have a significant number, and I'm pointing to Tubbs Inlet, Sunset Beach side have a significant number of structures coming out, and you have Ocean Isle have a significant number going in. And for the reasons, kind of touched on back in August and today. Still headed towards the hybrid vegetation line and defining that and what it means in terms of setbacks, but I'm thinking of going forward in rule amendments. At a minimum, the things that would need to be amended is your rules in 07H, 0304 define your AECs within the ocean hazard area, so you need to point to the reports that refer to the erosion rates and setbacks in the maps, and then also to your science panels, IHA boundary, map as well. 07H 310, that's your use standards for inland hazard areas. This is where we would need to go in and amend that language so that you're not pulling that adjacent OEA rate, but you're actually pointing to inlet setbacks based on inlet rates. And then also, this would be where, if we're gonna talk about hybrid vegetation line and potential use of that, then that's where that language would squeeze in. And then also in 0310, we would add some grandfathering language that at a minimum would point to existing grandfathering language that does apply currently to inland hazard areas in the ocean front. So right now, today, there's no difference of how your grandfathering is applied, but regardless of whether you're in IHA or oceanfront. But before we get to rules, let's talk about hybrid vegetation line. So some of you may recall that the hybrid vegetation line represents where the vegetation line was in its most landward position for just the period of study. So in this example at Tubbs Inlet on the Ocean Isle side, all the vegetation lines were started in 1970, the most recent is 2022. But of all those vegetation lines, the most landward segments are represented by the 1980, 1981, and 1993 vegetation lines. So you can kind of look at those veg lines and where they criss and cross. You can imagine that on the most landward side. That's why it's not just one vegetation line, because they're not linear. It's going to have, it's like the shoreline, you may have areas where you've got a cusp one particular year, and 5 years down the road, you don't have that. So it's just, it's a composite of all your data sets in there. And so as mentioned in the science panel study, what that was used for was measuring your landward boundary of your IHA. So just like on the ocean front, you're measuring your landward boundary of the ocean erodible area from the vegetation or pre-project line. But because there's more uncertainty and changes can happen very quickly at an inlet, the existing vegetation line, and this is long determined, this is back in 2010 even, but specifically the last study in this study, the hybrid vegetation line was considered a better use of looking at where the landward boundary might fall out. And we're defining the area that could be influenced by inlet processes. So the landward boundary was measured from that. So you get a 30-year risk line and 30-year risk line. Think of that the same thing as your minimum and maximum setback, your 30 times and your 90 times the erosion rate setback. So that's how your science kind of use that to define the boundary. And as was touched on, at some locations, the hybrid vegetation line, if we look at this photo, this is 2024, it generally looks like what the current vegetation looks like. But it's important to note that that doesn't always mean that's the most landward position the vegetation line has been. So if you look to the far left, well, there is a segment if you get out in the ocean front, you can see there's more shore veg line than before the period of study, but older than 1970, where it is more land. Now, if we jump to the other side, the hybrid vegetation line is much farther landward in relation to what the current vegetation, the location of the current vegetation line. And I'll talk more about it in a minute, but you can kind of think of this as, this is an example where the beach has been nourished, been maintained, got vegetation in front of the pre-project line. This is an example of where, all right, erosion had the vegetation line back there at some point in time. But natural accretion has moved the beach seaward, the vegetation is drawn out. But it's expected that at some point, when the erosion accretion cycle of this eminence gets flipped, erosion could potentially bring the vegetation line back to that point. I know there's probably some property owners of Ocean Isle that would love to see that flip in time. And, let Holden Beach share some of the erosion challenges they faced over since 1970. But again, that's not the most landward position that the vegetation line has ever been. So if we were to factor in older than 1970 vegetation, then the landward boundary of the IHA would even be farther to the east than it is. So this again, the hybrid vegetation line represents the most landward position only for the period of study. There, we do have some that are farther landward. So as I mentioned, you have the pre-project line that represents where the vegetation line is before artificial accretion has occurred, before the beach nourishment project. Again, the hybrid vegetation line essentially kind of represents that same thing, but instead of artificial accretion done through beach nourishment, Mother Nature has stepped in and those processes has accreted that beach seaward. So you have a natural versus an artificial. But in North Carolina, if it's a non-migrating inlet, as the science panel has pointed out, it's those inlets where you have accretion on one side and erosion on the other. At some point, it's unpredictable. You can kind of generally plan on if certain things happen, what might happen on the shoulders of the inlet. But it's expected that the erosion and accretion cycle will flip-flop at some point in time. So think of the hybrid vegetation line acting like a tree project, but rather than nourishment, you have Mother Nature nourishing the forest. If that were to continue, that would be great, but that's not always the case. So we know on the ocean front, without routine maintenance, that the shoreline and the vegetation line will eventually look like pre-project conditions. With inlet areas for non-migrating inlets in North Carolina, it's anticipated that at some point, we don't know, a 10-year cycle, 20 years, it could be 50 years, and it could be much longer, where Mother Nature is going to do that for you, and keep that cycle. She's no longer going to nourish where she's nourished in the past and bring erosion to where it once was. So when we're thinking about development, we're hopefully thinking about long term. We're not just thinking of, well, I just need to get 10 years out of this house or structure, and then anything can happen after that. So we're trying to think about long term as best we can. Now, looking at setbacks, what does it mean if we talk about setbacks relative to today's conditions, updating the erosion rates? And what if we measure setbacks from the hybrid vegetation line, what that means? So what I did is I just did a quick analysis and to see like how many structures might be affected by setback challenges based on today's conditions inside the new IHA relative to updated setback factors in the new IHA. And then again, relative to measuring setbacks from the hybrid vegetation line. So inside the proposed IHA, there's 866 structures. If we just use the setbacks requirements that we have in place today, there'll be 193 structures that might have challenges. I'm not saying definitely because we're basing this on a 2024 vegetation line and setbacks, and also including houses that if the setback lines that I created just kind of cut the edge of a structure, I went ahead and counted that as well. The numbers may not be that big, but anyway, I just wanted to kind of give a worst case scenario on the number of structures that might have issues with meeting the minimum setback.
Ken, let me poll the commission just a minute. We have the rest of this presentation, a couple more items. Does the commission want to take a lunch break or does the commission want to just keep on working until we get through?
I prefer to keep going myself.
Pardon? Roll on.
I'm actually getting close, so it's actually.
Notice I didn't say roll tide. I said roll on.
All right, so And if we look, so if we look at the first column, we have, like I said, 866 structures inside the proposed IJ. We jump over to setback scenario number 1, where we're measuring setback from the current vegetation line using current rates. That's what's in place today. Estimated 192 structures might have challenges meeting setback. And you see that there's some in there that are 0. And that's either because there are no, like, you point to right for beach on the Masonville Inlet side, there's currently no boundary. They're oriented the erosion rate setback 2 feet per year, so the structures that would be having a setback challenge. We jump to scenario number 2, measuring setback from current vegetation line using updated rates. And we jump to 243. And the reason why we're jumping is because we're using inlet erosion rates and not the adjacent OEA. So it's expected that we would see an increase in the number of structures. Now, if we measure setbacks from the hybrid vegetation line, then that number jumps up significantly. And this is where we got the last time when the science kind of recommended that, is how do we overcome not having 506 structures who at Holden Beach, who have lots of vegetation out in front of them, how do we tell them they're now non-conforming? And so that's the challenge. We're strictly measuring setbacks from the hybrid vegetation line, with them not also considering grandfathering. And how do we work with existing structures in their current location, but not automatically out of the gate and say they're non-conforming. We've got 200 yards of vegetation out front. But going back to the slide where the minimum rule requirements would occur, the definitions of the AECs within the ocean hazard area, use standards in O310. Again, that's where you would include hybrid vegetation line. Commission chose to go that direction and then clarify existing grandfathering apply. And this is kind of tiny, but it does show you what the ocean roadable area is. And as we do the enrollment, a lot of this yellow is just cleaning up and reorganizing and thinking about how RC is looking at this now, and now also factoring thinking about Jockey Ridge, where you have your definition of the AC, but when you go to O310, there's also a little bit of a descriptor in there to kind of set that up. So a lot of the yellow you're seeing here just represents its reorganization of that rule. So just for doing oceanfront erosion rates in the past, the only rule amendment that occurred was point to the new reports. That would occur down in Part C would just change the reference to the old from the old report to the new report. Now, if we go to the inlet hazard area, as I pointed out before, it's we kind of tweaking the definition of the inlet hazard area so that it's not specifically saying that in an area that where the inlet migrates. And then also too, looking at cleaning up the rules to remove in part A and B where it talks about areas included in the IJ would be an IJ except for the specific spot where there is no IJ, there's no inlet that was analyzed, so that naturally there would not be one there. So this would just be a cleaning up of that rule. And then at the bottom there, it says, in all cases, the inlet hazard area shall be an extension of the adjacent ocean erodible area, which makes up the ocean hazard area. And in no case shall be the width of an IJ be less than the adjacent ocean erodible area. So where you had an inlet migrate or erode, that gets a little bit weird when you're trying to establish the landward boundary of the OEA, which may now be much farther landward than the IHA because of how things have occurred. So by updating the IHA, that would not be needed. That's why that was stricken out. And you define that it must be, that the IHA must be greater than the OJ. It may be equal. And if you update it routinely, then it's not going to be less than. And so thinking about reorganizing definition of, hazard area and also formatting it so that it looks a lot like the definition of the ocean dwellable area. We would have to just create the section to report to the erosion rates, report in the maps. And also indeed to refer to the science panels of the report and map to define the boundaries. And just like on the ocean front, we define the minimum setback. Two, we would also do that hazard area. So regardless if you're accreting, your minimum setback requirement is only 2 times 30, give you that minimum 60 foot right. Setback. And then part B simply just gives you the link of reference so that you can access the report. All right, since we had this rule open, and I confirmed with the field staff and field officers, right now you have 3 unvegetated beach AEC designations. One is in Surf City, one is in North Pottsville that got put in place by the commission in the aftermath of Hurricane Florence in 2018. And after hurricane in 2020 at Oak Island, some sections you may recall the unvegetated beach is a temporary AEC that was established by the commission whenever there's no vegetation because it's wiped out by major storms. So we have established the measurement line to set back the measure from that until the vegetation line recovers. So those designations are no longer needed. So while we're cleaning up this rule, updating everything, we've also included this in there as well. And just as a quick refresher, at North Pottsville and Surf City, again, those are relatively small areas, but vegetation has recovered. So the measurement line is no longer needed. And in Oak Island, this is a continual 6 map, but it's a continuous line. That area has recovered too. So staff would be recommending that just go ahead and clean that up and undesignate those AEC with those locations. If we go to 310, again, we've got a little bit of clarification stuff. If we look at A1, this is where it currently refers to using the adjacent OEA rate, applying that in the IJ. We would just have to amend that so that it's pointing to erosion rates that are based on the setback factors based on erosion rates. And this is also where the commission chose to use the hybrid vegetation line for measuring setbacks. This is where we would include that. And I highlighted that in blue. So right now, just for discussion purposes, it says measuring setback from the coastline instead of natural project line, hybrid vegetation line, or measurement line, whichever is applicable. So we talked about that in the subgroup commission, kind of ironing that out a little bit. We can get more in the details there. And current 2, we removed the distinction between residential and commercial. Mother Nature and erosion doesn't care commercial and residential, so then we can be specific in the rules about that. And limiting this density, again, Mother Nature doesn't care if it's residential, commercial, but just taking that out, saying that only structures less than 5,000 square feet are permitted in IHA. So again, your use standards in an IHA control density, size of structure, size is 5,000 square feet. The density is no more than 1 unit per 15,000 square foot of land area. That's the current rule. But we're just taking out the distinction between commercial and residential. The current version of A4 established common law, statutory public rights of access to public trust, lands and waters, hazard areas shall not be eliminated or restricted. Development shall not encroach upon public access ways, nor shall it limit the intended use of access ways. Staff feel like that's not specifically needed any longer. So we recommending the commission consider just taking that out. And so the new proposal would be the new A4 would just be a reference to existing grandfathering rules. Just to make sure, because that was one of the things that I got last time in public comments was how does grandfathering apply in IHA? So we felt it was important to place a marker in that rule so that folks could reference it does apply, even though it does currently today apply. Just to include that, that may be something RRC notices that, hey, you've already got that rule, may not be required, but staff will be kind of proposing, to just include that reference so that everyone knows that grandfathering provisions that currently apply still apply. All right, so I'll get back to that. But when we think about the hybrid vegetation line, the grandfathering rules that we've got now basically benefit structures that are 5,000 to 10,000 square feet. So the cap on using grandfathering applies to structures no greater than 10,000. So the minimum setback is still in place. You still have to meet 60 feet or 30 times whatever the regular setback is. The structures that are 5,000 square feet or less, they're going to have to meet that minimum requirement. So the real benefit, structures that are benefiting on those, that 5,000 to 10,000 size limit. But when we think about using hybrid vegetation line, and we think about that big number of 500 structures that have tons of vegetation and it cannot be set back, and it may be less than 5,000 square feet. Existing grandfathering wouldn't necessarily apply to them because they have to meet the minimum setback, but we'll say, hey, now your marker is the hybrid vegetation line rather than the first line instead of natural. We've restricted use of that vegetation line. So with the current grandfathering language, would not necessarily benefit structures less than 5,000 square feet if they're measuring from the hybrid vegetation. So when we think about if that's something the commission wants to pursue, something else may need to be added to grandfathering to account for, but if you've got a hybrid vegetation line, you're less than 5,000 square feet, but you've got 200 yards or more vegetation out in front of you. What do you do in a scenario like that? So that's sort of something that has to be considered. And the last time, one of the factors that wasn't, when staff talked about, when you have local government, you have essentially like a developer line that says, hey, we don't allow development here to be seaward than this, even though they can be setback. So that was one of the factors that were considered, but current grandfathering doesn't necessarily apply to all structures, but they have to be setback from the hybrid. That makes sense.
Somewhat. However, this item does need to be included in the subcommittee. That's a big one. That's a big one. So please. Go ahead.
I'm done now.
Questions for Ken? Larry?
Maybe get a little bit in the weeds, but when, you're doing, calculating these erosion rates, renourishment, sandbags, how does it directly impact the erosion rate? I mean, if somebody, continues to renourish, doesn't renourish, in a particular year or time you're looking at it.
Yeah, so it's definitely part of the calculation. So we're not looking at it saying, it's not a mathematical thing, it's just a matter of, you're basically setting that erosion plot. So we can point to all the things that goes back on the right. Actually, any community that's got a beach management plan, and doing routine maintenance, eventually that is translated into a low erosion rate. Look at all the towns on one way, rather than rates, or it may be a 3D, but the erosion rate setback factor is applied to look at most of the ocean front and ocean isles. Look at on the beach, but it's going to ultimately translate into a lower erosion rate. But what I've seen in the past is it takes some time to get there. So it's not like I did one nourishment project, now my rates should be lower. Maybe not, because we just have to have the data to support the erosion rate. So it does get.
That's where it's going back to 1970, using 50-some years of at least looks in the past. It averages out to get some type of linear regression rate. The other question I've got is, your smoothing technique was, I think you took 17 transits. Do you just start with transit 1, go to 17, and that's a block, then you go to 18 and 35, is that a block? Or or is it progressive when you're trying to do that smoothing technique?
Yeah, so we've got about 8 different blocking rules, and one of those is basically when I do a erosion base, I do an island block, I'll take Sunset Beach, and I'll do it, I'll go from inlet to inlet, and I'll start at one inlet, and let that's transact number 1. But when I do my smoothing and blocking, so 17 transacts. So where you have less than 17 transacts, I do approach the inlet, you start dropping off to in the average. So as you approach the inlet, even though I'm saying 17, you don't have 17 transacts average, you actually get less. So when you get down to the lab, 3 transacts, you're only averaging 3 transacts versus 17. So 17, so I start at one inlet, hit Tubbs Inlet, or from the Ocean Isle, go to Tubbs with Shallotte. And that's one set of transects that I'm smoothing. So it's going basically island by island, separated by inlet or separated by the cape. So when I get the cape, that reorients the transect and the orient. So I don't factor transects that are facing south, transects that are facing east, all the transects orients, but or beach facing the same. I don't know if that makes sense. Beach or how does that? What's that? You're right.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, when the motion was passed,
Earl, can you speak into your microphone just a little bit better? Thank you.
send it back to the science panel, 5-year update. There was a list of open items. Some of them were in the original science panel study, some of them were ones that came up in public comments, and some came up from other things. And I passed that back to you. Are we going to get a item by item responses to what's done in this latest proposed stuff?
Right, so the questions that I get, typically how we've done this, we do this in the past is, once we get the public hearing, so we take all the questions that we get during the public hearing process, and then we provide that to the commission and things that we need to respond to, we can do that. But like we did the last time, things that pertain to what the science panel did, we submitted it, we collected all those comments and sent that to the science panel. So the last time they did that, and that was actually submitted to the commission. So just like the last time, we would collect all that at a point in time and then provide that in one lump effort back to the commission for consider. So it's just part of the rulemaking process. We just haven't quite got there yet, but we have to do public hearings in all the 8 oceanfront counties. And I know that I'll get lots of emails and stuff as the commission goes forward. And so we'll provide all that to the commission and provide some feedback. And then also throw that out to the panel to see that it's something that they need to respond to, just so the commission can see that and evaluate that in the consideration.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm anticipating that there are some public people who will come back and ask, what did you do with the comment that I provided? I'd like to be able to answer.
Yep, and those were submitted to the panel, so that those went through the process. It's a part of it where the commission sees it. And if there's something they see in there that, all right, we need to revisit, whether it's a rule amendment or something else, and reevaluate that based on the comment they felt justified going back and revisiting. That's it, whether it's a rule amendment or an agency designation.
I was just, one of the big takeaways for me, both yet today and yesterday, sitting in on the CRAC meeting, is it's kind of jarring to look at that HDL and know that there's a reasonable expectation that at some point in time, the shoreline's going to be right there. That's, that's sobering. And I think it makes it more important that we get this work done.
Okay. Jordan?
The grandfathering, what would that quite look like?
And that's a great question. So right now, grandfathering applies to structures that were built prior to August 11th of 2009. So that's when your grandfathering or your graduated setback rules went into effect. So if you were built prior to that, then the grandfathering provision applies to you, where you cannot exceed the existing footprint, and you have to meet the minimum setback of 60 feet or erosion rate times 30. And then you can be no greater than 10,000 square feet. So the commission went through an exercise of looking at square footage many years back. But that's the conditions on grandfathering today. What it would look like in terms of using it with the hybrid vegetation line, would require more thought. It could be something as simple as if your structure built prior to this date, then you measure setback from the vegetation line. If you're built after this date, then you measure setback from the hybrid vegetation. It could be something that simple, but it could get more detailed.
Tancred,
Just a quick,
let me, Tancred
I
needs to
just-
address it.
you said 30, I thought it was multiplied by 60.
30 times the erosion, so 30 times 2 give you 60 feet. That's the state minimum setback.
Right.
That's the, or
But in the inlet hazard, wasn't there a higher threshold?
Are you thinking about, so one of the benefit that comes with having a beach management plan is structures greater than 5,000 only have to meet a 60-foot times 30, stuff like that. And then there's the small structure exception. So when we look at like Ocean Isle or we look at North Topsail with these higher erosion rates, you have to remember now that the RRC just actually passed your 0309 exception rule that says, hey, if you can't meet the setback requirement in place at the time the proposed development is in place, that you can utilize that small structure exception. If you have 60 feet from the vegetation line, you can build a structure up to 2,500 square feet. So today you can do that. It doesn't matter if your erosion rate is 5,000 foot a day. You got 60 feet in front of you and the vegetation line, you can build a 2,500 square foot house. That's today.
Tancred.
So I just wanted to add a little bit to Commissioner Hennessy's question. So the three criteria to qualify for the grandfathering. One is the community has an unexpired set of an exception, beach management plan, or that structure is constructed prior to August 11, 2009. So the grandfathering that's currently applied on the OEA, the oceanfront erodible, is this exact same grandfathering that would apply with the IHS. And that's current rule.
That's in place today. So that's nothing new. Thanks, Tank. I knew there was something I was leaving out.
So the crack group, they had some questions about that.
That was not discussed in their meeting. They had questions about it. So that's why the subcommittee is going back and meeting with CRAC and bringing something back to the commission through the CRAC. Because there was a lot of concern about grandfathering exceptions and where we were going. So they're going to have that discussion and then bring something back. Ken?
I knew this would not go to full length, but we wanted to make sure we had time for questions.
That's okay. We're not done yet. If anybody's got questions, ask them. This will come back to us in February as we move forward. And hopefully, committee meeting between CRAC and CRC members will bring back something to this CRAC to bring forward to us.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the work. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Nice job, Ken.
Phew, you and the science panel have done an incredible amount of work. Dr. Moore, please tell your science panel, thank you. It's mind-boggling almost. Thank you. All right. Sarah, the floor is yours.
I will turn on my phone. I emailed all of you the legal update. I wanted to make one clarification on the third-party hearing request for Sierra Club. I had put it was granted overall, it was granted, but, it was granted in part and denied in part. And I believe, Director Miller had mentioned that yesterday in his staff report as well, but that is in the order and that was communicated to them. I just wanted to clarify that from the legal update. Otherwise, if there are any questions on the legal update that I can answer, again, I am not litigating the majority of those cases at this point. So if you have any questions, you can email me. I can email the attorneys who are on the litigation team for that, or I can have them prepare an update or come back at your February meeting. But otherwise, I don't have any other information to share at this point.
Okay, any questions for Sarah? No, thank you, Sarah. We'll see how the third-party challenges go, one of which was to the Mid-Currituck County Bridge. That's one Sarah was referring to that was granted in part and denied in part. I believe there's 11 items and oh, sorry, not hearing me right now, sorry. That was the one that was over Mid-Currituck Bridge. They had protested nine or 11 variations of the rules, and only 2 were permitted to go forward. The other nine or so were denied. So that will go to OAH. Right, Sarah, you still have the floor because you're going to be conducting the new business of officer elections.
Every 2 years, you all have to have an election for chair, vice chair, and your second vice chair. I am going to conduct the election for chair, and then whoever you all elect as chair will conduct the election for the other 2 positions. This is based on statute and based on your bylaws. How this is going to work, just so you all know in advance, in case you forgot 2 years ago, and I wasn't here, so maybe Mary did it differently. Is that first we will take nominations from the floor and second, and then I will have, we will do votes on each of the nominations as they have been submitted. We will take votes on each of the nominations, and then if any of those have gotten a majority vote, that will be considered the chair. If it is in an instance of a tie, Robert's rule says that you keep voting until there is a majority vote. So for example, if there are 3 candidates, A, B, and C, we will vote on A, we'll vote on B, we'll vote on C. And then we'll see if any of those have gotten the majority vote. Are there any questions before we get started about just the process? Hearing none, at this point, I would entertain any motions for nominations for chair.
I would like to nominate Renee Cahoon to continue as chair of the Coastal Resources Committee.
I'll second that.
And I'm sorry, I heard Coleman as a second, and I heard somebody else as a second. Okay. Are there any further nominations for chair? Is there a second on that motion?
Oh, I'll second that.
Just making sure all my i's are dotted and my t's are crossed. Second. Okay, hearing one nomination for chair. We will take the vote to make Commissioner Cahoon the chair. All in favor? I see. Oh, no, okay, now it's server. Okay, 2, 9. Did you get 9 too? 9. All right, I have a vote of 9. That being the majority of the members present today, and the only nomination for chair, that motion passes. you remain chair, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you very much. Appreciate that. I will try to continue to do my best. Sure, absolutely.
And we come here.
Angela's been sick for 3 weeks. She has a bad case of pneumonia. And as you've seen how many people it takes to fill her position. Yes, just leave your tags behind their collectors. She does. She takes care of a lot more than maybe we all realize. Next up would be, Sarah, I'm assuming I take over now.
Yes,
Next
ma'am.
up would be first vice chair. And I believe I'm allowed to make a nomination. I nominate Neil Andrew. Is there a second? Seconded by Lauren Sheila. Any other nominations for vice chair? If not, Mr. King moves that nominations be closed. Seconded. All in favor of his motion to close? Now, all in favor of Neil for vice chair? Raise your hands again, just make sure I get it. 9-2, I believe. 9 in favor. Neil, you're the vice chair. Now, motion on the floor for, or nominations are needed for the second vice chair. Is there a nomination?
Madam Chair, I'd like to nominate Sheila Holman as second vice chair.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Lauren. Any other nominations for second vice chair? Okay, thank you. If there's no other nominations, we'll proceed to a vote. All in favor of Sheila for second vice chair? 9. I believe it's 9. Okay, thank you all very much. Officers are set. Next and final item on the agenda is approval of the meeting dates for 2026. I believe you all have that February, April, June, August, and October. Are those meeting dates okay with the commission? I need a vote.
Madam Chair, I move approval for the proposed, sorry, proposed 2026 meeting.
Thank you. Is there a second? You are. Thank you. All in favor? All opposed? We are so approved. And is there any other new business or old business to come before the commission today? DR?
Madam Chair, when we, last year went to see the groin at, Ocean Isle, my memory is that, we were told that we're being monitored to see how it was working. So I was wondering if we could get an update from the town or the engineer or a copy of that, whatever that monitoring, so we can better understand.
Okay. And I would probably tell you that one of the dates that we have on this agenda will be go back to Ocean Isle Beach and also try to take a field trip as well to see the ruin. Jordan?
Two things. One is just a simple request, and that's when the Rules Review Commission is hearing CRC rules and business, if the staff can let us know when that's happening. So I don't go and monitor their agenda, so don't know when our stuff is coming up, whether it's approved, not approved. We don't really get any updates. I just found out from listening to Ken that the small structure one was approved. That's one. And then the other is prior to these meetings, we get dumped with a bunch of information. It would be, and I know it's tricky, but it'd be nice if we could have some of that spread out throughout the in between periods of meetings versus just it all being dumped on 10 days before the meeting.
That is possible probably on everything but variances because they have a deadline. I did extend the deadline for the Ocean Isle Beach variances so that they could be heard at this meeting in order for them to expedite.
I understand variances would be tricky, but some of the other stuff I think can be probably
Okay.
staggered out.
I'm sure staff will work on prioritizing which ones can be sent out sooner. Sheila?
Earlier today, when we were discussing the septic tank rules, there, I believe, Madam Chair, you made a comment that there were, certain communities that have, central sewer systems. And it might be helpful, to me to understand where those are located and where we have septic systems in place, because as I was thinking about variance yesterday on Ocean Isle, I immediately thought whether Ocean Isle has.
They have central sewage. They do.
Thank you.
Yes. Only because the mayor and I were talking about central sewage last night, and there's some of their land acquisitions that they made for their to expand their central sewage at one time. But yes, I think that can be forward to the commission as well, those communities that have septic tanks. And really, the only ones we need to be discussing would be those communities that have septic tanks. So I think if we got a list of those communities would be helpful. Okay. Any other business? If not, thank you all very much. Thank you for all the questions about inlet hazard and those it's a huge document, and there's going to be a lot of questions. There's going to be a lot of comments, and there's going to be a lot of discussion back and forth, I'm sure. So we look forward to all the questions, and it's going to be interesting to see the public comments as we decide how to move forward. So if there's nothing else, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.